Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I wanted to say hello and welcome to everyone. Welcome to everyone here and then everyone listening or watching online. Welcome to Zaytuna College for the second lecture in our faculty lecture series. Iqra was the first word revealed to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Iqra, meaning read or recite, established the centrality of reading in particular and seeking knowledge in general in our tradition. Therefore, it's imperative that in our community, when we think of the place we are as Muslims in America right now, it's imperative for us to be conscious about our relationship to knowledge and our pursuit of knowledge. Towards that end, Zaytuna College is an important part of this story of Islam in America. And so we're asking for everyone's support. First, with your prayers, please keep us in your du'as. Second, with your financial support, such as joining us on February 18th for the benefit dinner with all three co-founders in San Jose. And third, by spreading the word about Zaytuna, considering applying or telling others about applying. And although the application deadline has passed, we're still accepting late applications. As for today, the title of Shaykh Hamza Yusuf's lecture is How to Read a Book, which alludes to a book written in 1940 by Mortimer Adler. The suggestion for this lecture came from students, and so we'd like to thank them for that suggestion, and we'd like to say to everyone else, we hope that this can provide a step for allowing us to work together as Muslims in America, thinking consciously about our relationship to knowledge and building institutions of knowledge here in America. And finally, may God allow all of us to benefit from everything that is going to follow in this talk. Without further ado, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf.
Assalamu alaikum to everybody in the data sphere. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa salam tasliman kathira, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-ali al-azim. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Alhamdulillah, it's good to see everybody. I've been absent. I've actually haven't been well either, so I request everybody's dua, inshallah. The topic, inshallah, I'm going to discuss tonight is actually taken from a book which I was fortunate enough to actually have studied with Dr. Adler in seminars, and he was a friend of my father's. And my father had studied with one of his mentors who actually taught him how to read a book. And that was Mark Van Doren, who was my father's teacher at Columbia for my father's duration at that university. And Van Doren used to teach a course using great books or classic literature. And out of that came a group of intellectuals in the United States that adopted a certain program that they believe would help revive liberal arts colleges. But one of the things that they recognized, and Adler wrote this book for this reason, is that most people do not really know how to read very well. We learn abecedarian reading, which is basically how to read letters on a book. We can open up a book and read words. But to actually become a really good reader, a solid reader, is a set of skills that are acquired over actually a long period of time. And one of the things about our tradition in particular, it really is a tradition that is rooted in reading. The Prophet ﷺ's first revelation was Iqra, is read. And he was told, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, read in the name of your Lord. And the ba there, bismi, in the name of, is what the Arab grammarians term ba al-isti'ana. It's the ba that you use, the instrumental ba. In other words, it's the means by which you to read. And so there's really a mystical component to reading that is hinted or alluded to in the first revelation of Islam, that there is a type of reading that is done that is not the reading that the Prophet ﷺ was referring to when he said, Ma ana biqari, I'm not a reader. So the Prophet ﷺ was talking about this type of just reading a book, abecedarian reading. And what Adler refers to in this book as really plumbing the depths of a book, he talks about comprehensive reading. He talks about elementary reading is one type of reading, and then informational reading. And then he talks about comprehensive reading, which is reading for insight, for understanding. And that is really at the root of Islam. It's really getting to insight and understanding. And so this book actually, I think, is really one of the most important books that I've seen in the English language, because it's a key to other books. It really can help you read other books. And it was written by somebody who learned how to read from a master reader. And the Adler talks about when he first started teaching at Columbia, he took a course with John Erskine, who was a very famous philosopher. And it was a really extraordinary course. It was an honors course. They read 2 years. They read 60 great books in 2 years. So they'd read a book a week, and then they would come together and discuss it. And these were all really advanced students. And he was convinced that this was, he said, it wasn't that I discovered gold, it's that I actually owned the mine. That he really felt that he had just taken possession of this incredible treasure, which was all of this knowledge that had been passed down through the ages. And this radically changed his perspective on learning, and he felt that the best way to really learn at the college level was through discussion. It was through reading texts and really discussing them. But what happens is he became, when he graduated, he actually became a teacher of that course. And he thought, oh, I've done this course, I know all these books, and I'm ready to go. But being, he said, the diligent teacher that he was, he decided to read each of the books again a second time, even though he was convinced that he knew them. And he said he was dumbstruck because when he read them again, it felt like he'd never read them before. And this is one of the hallmarks of a really, really good book, is that the more you read it, the more you get out of it. It's not, you don't just read a really great book one time. And Adler argues really that any book worth reading has to be read 3 times. But he does say that the book can be, by a master reader, they can learn how to do all 3 readings in one reading. But generally it's going to take 1 or 2 readings. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of students just assume is, one, if they don't understand something, they'll just ask the teacher. Right? So if I don't understand something, I can just ask the teacher, what does that mean? And that's a type of intellectual laziness when you are grappling with something, because the fact that you don't understand it is either one of 2 things. It's so beyond your grasp that you just don't have access to it. So for instance, if you're not trained in mathematics and you pick up a book on physics, it's just not going to benefit you because you don't have the prerequisites for studying that book. But the other possibility is that you haven't given it enough thought. You haven't put the time in. Now I'll give you an example. The Metaphysics, which is considered one of the more difficult books, probably the most difficult book in Aristotle's compendium of writings. The Metaphysics, Ma Wara al-Tabi'a in Arabic, was translated into Arabic. Ibn Sina, the great scholar, philosopher, said that he had read the book 50 times and still couldn't get it. And he had pretty much given up hope on it. And he said he went to a store, and this scholar, this bookseller said, I have a book that I think you'll really like. And it was an introduction to the the terms that Aristotle was using in the metaphysics. And Ibn Sina just told him, no, I don't want that book. I've spent enough time on that book. He said, no, you should read this, an amazing book, and you should really, he said, no, I don't want it. And so the man said, look, you can have it as a gift. So he gave the man the book. Well, Ibn Sina went home and he decided to read the book. And that book was the key that unlocked the metaphysics for him. So sometimes a book needs prerequisites to get to it, right? He had tried to understand it, but he didn't have the tools necessary to understand the book. Most of the books that you see in our tradition, if you take a book, for instance, like Tuhfat al-Ahwadi, which is a commentary on Imam al-Tirmidhi. If you take a book like that, the hadith pretty much assumes one thing. The Prophet ﷺ assumes one thing when he's speaking, that you understand the Arabic of the 7th century, because he was speaking to the most intelligent, literate people, and he was speaking to the most common people of his peninsula. And he said, نحن أمة أمية لا نكتب ولا نحسب. We're an unlettered community, meaning his first community. We don't read and we don't calculate. So everything that he said, according to Imam al-Shatibi, was meant to be understood by the average Arab of that time, who was illiterate. Now, when we look at the language, we can see how far we've fallen as a species, because the Arabic language of the 7th century was the pinnacle. Just like in our culture, it's been argued that the English language reached its pinnacle in the late 16th, early 17th century, with people like Shakespeare, the committee that translated the King James Bible, people like John Donne, Milton. I mean, this is where English reaches its pinnacle. And very often it's the poets, and because I just mentioned 3 poets that represent the pinnacle of the English language. Very often it's the poets that achieve that supremacy over other generations in terms of language. And certainly in Islam it was no different, because in the 7th century Arabic had reached its pinnacle with the Jahili poets. And that's when revelation comes as a crown on that vast body of language that existed. But it was because they had such extraordinary language skills and they were able to understand poetry. And if you can understand poetry in any language, you can understand anything written in that language. I'm talking about good poetry. And that's why poetry is so important to study, because one of the things that poets do, people that have very literal type minds, they say, why doesn't he just say what he means? Why is the poet, why does he talk in metaphors? Why does he talk in this ambiguous language? Because when you study poems, like 2 rows diverged in a wood and I, right? Well, what does he mean 2 rows diverged in a yellow wood? Like, what's he mean 2 rows diverged in a wood? Is he really talking about being on a path, walking down a Vermont bucolic scene, and he comes off 2 roads in a yellow wood, and there he is, sorry, I could not travel both. So he's there kind of wishing he could go down both. Is that really what he's talking about? Or is he talking about something deeper, right? And there's different ways that you can read things. You can read them at a literal level. And that would be, he just came on 2 paths in a wood, and it's fall probably because everything's yellow, and the leaves are falling because he talks about the leaves on the path. So maybe that's one level. That's a level of reading called the literal level. So basically, when you look at this incredible tradition of scholarship, and I was using the example of that book, authors, the Prophet ﷺ, when he spoke, his prerequisite is that you understand 7th century Arabic well. And if you do, you can understand what he's saying. Ad-deenu nasiha. There's a reason why he said ad-deen as opposed to deenun. Or there's a reason why he said ad-deenu. He didn't say nasihatun. He could have said ad-deenu nasihatun, ad-deenu nasiha. But he used article of definition for both the mubtada and the khabar, right? For the subject and the predicate in that sentence. Why? There's a reason. And if you know, you don't have to know grammar to understand that. If you know Arabic in the way that the 7th century Jahili Arabs knew it, because they would know exactly what it meant. That was their language. And so language, the prerequisite for understanding oral communication is simply the skills that we have in language. But they're very complicated. I mean, even the most aboriginal languages are incredibly complex. Doesn't matter how simple language gets, it's always complex. And it's a miracle that children learn how to speak, just syntax, and how they work out. And then generative grammar, how they generate grammar. Because children will say things that they've never heard said before. They'll start formulating sentences at 3, 4 years old, and they've never heard those sentences before, but they're generating language. So humans are language generators. We naturally generate language. Now, at a certain point, people started writing down. Allama bil qalam. Allah says we taught by the pen. And because the Lawh al-Mahfuz is one of the really profound images in the Islamic tradition, this idea of the Lawh and the qalam, that God made this tablet and then He made a pen and He told the pen to write on the tablet. So everything that is, was, and ever will be was actually written down according to this narrative. So there's a reading, and then on Yawm al-Qiyamah, what do? You read your sahifa. You're given your book, and you're told to read it. Iqra kitab. You have to read your actions. Everything that you did, it's all recorded. Kitabun marqum. In some kind of, who knows what, I mean, that modern language, marqum means digital. Ruqam is digit, but it could also mean written. A written book or a digital book, Allahu alam. But it's a book that recorded everything. And we know that we've got scriveners, angelic scriveners that are writing things down, right? Taking notes. So reading is central to the Islamic tradition. It's all about reading. And then reading signs in the self and on the horizon. So if you look, when the Prophet ﷺ was told to read, and he said, I don't know how to read. He said, no, read. Again, I don't know how to read. Read. This is a different type of reading. It's a deeper type of reading. And then we're told, and this is very interesting because even though semiotics it's an ancient concept, the idea of the simos, the symbols. It's an ancient concept. I mean, the Greeks talked about it. But the fact that one of the most important areas of philosophical pursuit is in this whole area of semiotics and signs and symbols and meanings. And the fact that the Quran identifies itself as a book of signs. And signs are to be interpreted. You have to know what a sign, you have to be able to read a sign in order for that sign to be meaningful for you. If you don't read the sign, it's of no benefit. If you come and there's a sign that says danger, cliff ahead, sharp turn, and you speak Russian and the sign's in Arabic, and you go off the cliff, it's because you couldn't read that sign. But if you saw the sign, you read the sign in a language you understood, you'd save yourself from the danger of possible destruction or destruction itself. So reading it's just foundational. Now, if you look, one of the things he points out, if you look, one of the first and most important things, there are many types of reading, but basically there are 3 fundamental things that people read for. One is amusement. Less so today than ever before. Traditionally, people read for amusement as a pastime, and you would often see people just on trains or before that even just sitting with a book. Henry David Thoreau talks about meeting a farmer in Massachusetts out near Concord, where he was staying near Walden Pond, who was plowing a field, and he had Homer's Iliad in his pocket in Greek. And then when he would take time to rest, he would sit down and he would read Homer's Iliad. And Thoreau said, I started discussing it with him because at that time, Massachusetts had about a 98% literacy rate. They've never achieved that before. And one of the things they studied in grammar schools was Latin and Greek. So here's a peasant farmer, who's reading Homeric Greek, which is, it's difficult Greek. There's four Greeks. There's Homeric, there's Attic Greek, which is the Greek of Plato, and then you have Koine Greek, which is New Testament Greek, and now you have modern Greek. And each one is a very distinct language. The Homeric is really the most vast in terms of vocabulary, just like Jahili Arabic. It's much vaster than what comes after. I mean, the Quran reduces the vocabulary considerably because the Quran was meant to be understood by lots and lots of people. So the actual number of words in the Quran are far less than exist in the Arabic language. And there's no really difficult words in the Quran. It was very interesting. The Quran uses very easy to grasp terms. There's what they call gharib al-Quran, but generally it's not difficult Arabic in that way. So he meets this, and he said, when he started discussing it, he really didn't have an idea of the themes of the book, but he just thought it was the greatest yarn he'd ever read. This yeoman, he's reading it for amusement. Now, Socrates quotes Homer a lot for edification, like he uses him as a source of wisdom. And it could be argued that the whole foundation of Greek civilization is Homer, is the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? But you could read the Iliad purely for amusement. It's just a great yarn for somebody. Now that people read like People magazine, you see people reading People and Self and Us, right? All these, it used to be Life. Now it's Self, right? So they read these, and these are kind of these opiate magazines out there, just everybody just reads them, and they're kind of meaningless tripe, and there's nothing really in them. You're not going to be edified to find out that so-and-so's got bulimia, or so-and-so's getting a divorce, or, Angelina is upset with, what's the other one? No, the girl that, Jennifer, there you go. See, we know all these things because it's in your face everywhere, right? You can't go to the supermarket. My mom's 90 and she was at the supermarket and there was an old lady with her. I mean, she's not old for my mom because she was probably only around 75. My mom says old is 10 years, whatever you are, older than whatever you are. So for my mom, 100 is old now. But, this older lady looks at my mom. They're looking at all the magazines on that rack, National Enquirer and Spectator, whatever they are. People, and she just looked at my mom and she said, "Aren't you glad we're on the way out?" So what's interesting is if you look at somebody like Dorothy Sayers. I mean, she was lamenting how bad it was in the 1940s. I mean, they could only, I think they would just drop dead by what they see now. But that's one type of reading. Then you have informational reading like Time or Newsweek, just to get some information like what's happening in Iraq, or what's happening with the Republican race, things like that. So you get type of information. And that is it's easy to read. It's not that hard if you're educated. I mean, they're writing probably at about 7th or 8th grade level. I mean, that's it. Most books now, according to, a friend of mine who's was asked to write a book for a major publisher, was asked, at what level do you want? He said, generally the books that we publish now are at a 6th grade level. If you look at, according to, studies of the language of debates, Kennedy's and Nixon's debates were at about 11th grade level of understanding, high school. Lincoln-Douglas debates were at graduate school level. Right? If you just analyze the language and the type of level they were speaking. Now it's about 5th to 6th grade level. That's what they're talking at. So this is a kind of dumbing down, but people, that's the level that information is being written on. The last reason to read is to learn something, for understanding, what he calls comprehensive reading. It's actually to illuminate your understanding. Now what's interesting is one of the things that Adler argues is he says that people will say, oh, I can't read that book, it's over my head. And he said that is the very reason why you should read it. Because if you always read things that are at your level, you will never improve yourself. You won't get anything. But when you read something that's over your head, it forces you to, like pull-ups, right? The bar's over your head. And so as you pull up, right, it's really hard at first, but if you keep trying, it gets easier and easier. You can do more and more. Now, one of the things St. Augustine said about his education, and he was educated in what are called now in our tradition the liberal arts, even though most liberal arts majors cannot, if you ask them what are the liberal arts, they won't be able to tell you. Even though they have a bachelor's in the liberal arts or a master's in the liberal arts, they won't be able to tell you actually what they refer to. But Augustine wrote a book called, it's not really a book, but it's an essay on Christian doctrine, in which he argues that it was essential for people to know these language arts before they went into the Bible to understand it. And he identifies them as grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And what he said, by mastering these arts, he said he was able to read, that he was able to understand anything that he read and to articulate anything he thought. I mean, that's the definition of a literate person. That they can understand what they read and they can articulate what they think. Because a lot of people can't articulate their thoughts. I wish I could put it into words, what I'm trying to say. But they don't have that. That's a skill. Some people have it more naturally than others, but it is a skill that can be acquired. It's not magic. You have to have words. You have to know how words are put together. And so basically, what he says is he wrote this book for that third type of reading. He didn't read it for those first two. He said, if you're interested in those types of reading, don't bother with this book. You're just wasting your time. And so what he says is the first thing he talks about reading, the word itself. You have to know words, because one of the real problems with language is that we simply assume, because we learn language as children, we heard our parents say things in context, and we worked it out. We worked out what words mean in context. But many words are ambiguous. You have in logic something called an amphibole, which is where you have double entendres, syntax that can actually mean different things, even though it's said the same way. Sometimes it's written, and sometimes it's how you speak it, right? Like, if in America you have the right to bear arms, right? What does that mean? You can have a weapon. Some people could think what you meant was you have the right to take off your shirt and show your arms, right? Because in some cultures, women don't have the right to bear arms. Like in Saudi Arabia, it's illegal for a woman to bear her arms, right? So there's an example, of something that's just, the language is not clear. Now that's a kind of humorous example, but people actually misunderstand language all the time for that reason. And you have a whole set of fallacies in logic called the fallacies of equivocation, which is where things can mean more than one thing. We're using a term to mean different things. To give you an example, you could say that, only men are rational animals, right? Does everybody agree with that statement? Generally, I mean, jinn are rational and angels are rational, but we'll just, some people don't really accept those other categories. So we'll just say all men are rational animals. You accept that, Mahasan? Yeah? Okay. Women are not men. Therefore, women are not rational animals, right? Does that sound reasoning? Yeah, okay, good. See, the equivocal term there is man, because in the first term, it's a universal term that includes women. But in the conclusion, I'm basically excluding women from men. So I'm using a term, right, ambiguously, which is one of the rules in logic that you cannot do. Terms have to be unambiguous. So what he says is you have to know the words that the author is using and how he's using them. And that's very important. So reading, what does reading mean? Like reading. What does it mean? I'm not reading you, Fatima. You know, what does that mean? I'm not reading you. I don't know what you mean, right?
You don't understand.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know where you're coming from. I'm not reading you, right? Or, you know what, Mahasin, you're reading between the lines here, right? I mean, we can use the word in a lot of different ways, right? But, and so there's a basic meaning, which is just to read. But if you actually look, one of the meanings in Old English for read is the fourth stomach of a ruminant, right? Because ruminants have 4 stomachs. And what do ruminants do? They chew the cud, right? And they swallow it, and then what do? They spit it back up, chew it some more, swallow it, spit it back up, chew it some more. So isn't it interesting that our word to read and to ruminate, to ponder things, has to do with this idea of chewing. You know, Bacon said that some books are to be tasted, some books are to be swallowed, and some books are to be chewed and digested. Right? So the idea that reading is something that's, it's not just this superficial thing here, even in our language. And that's one of the beauties of a dictionary of etymology, you see, because you can really get, you know, Heidegger, who's a German philosopher, said language is the house of being. What do you think he meant by that? Language is the house of being. I mean, first of all, what's being? How's he using that term? Being is a term.
Like it's something not static, it's constant.
What is being? Existence, right? Everything that is, right, has existence, that's being. Like this, so metaphysics is the study of being, right? So when he says language is the house of being, what's he mean? What happens in a house? You live in it, right? You know, you live in your house. It's where you spend your time. So for us as conscientious beings, right, because we're really, out of all these other animals that are out there, we're the ones that are thinking about what's going to happen to, you know, my retirement plan. You know, there's no birds worrying about their 401ks. They're not out there. There's no lizards that are like, oh my God, the economy is so depressed. You know, what am I going to do? You know, right? They're not out there. But because we can actually think about things, you know, cogitate, think about the future, worry about the future, like language is where all this experience is residing, right? It's residing in our language. And he felt that if you could get back, he believed Greek was the essential language. That if you could get back to these ancient terms from the Greeks, you could really understand like if you could really get to the meaning of philos and agape and eros, terms that dealt with love, because there's different types of love. The Greeks distinguish. The Arabs distinguish. We don't really distinguish. We have to use adjectives to differentiate between our types of love. But other languages actually have different words for different types of love because they recognize they're not the same. So one of the really important things to have when you're reading seriously is if you're reading a great writer, because great writers, they differ from other writers in that they're very specific about the words they use. You know, and when you get into poetry, it's even more so because poets are not only using words based on their meanings, but they're using words based on their sounds. Like in English, we have mutes and liquids. Do you know mutes and liquids? Like ka is a mute, because a mute sound, you have to have a vowel to complete it, right? So you have a word like stop, you know, the P is a mute sound. So, you know, if a poet uses a mute as opposed to a liquid, he's doing it for effect, or she is doing it for effect. So just learning the sounds of words, of why we would choose stone over rock, And they're very different sounds, aren't they? Stones, stepping stone. We don't say stepping rocks, right? But a stone is a rock, and a rock is a type of stone, right? But when we think of rock, it's very different thing of stone, right? So poets will even be more specific. But great writers always use words very specifically. They're not sloppy in that way. And that's why modern writers, I had a teacher, a Mauritanian, who said the difference between the ancients and the moderns is ancients wrote a sentence that could be commented on in a book. He said moderns write books that could be summed up in a sentence. Right? It's very different. And I found that to be very true. Most of the books that I read by modern writers, they really could be summed up very briefly. Whereas if you read a book like Qawaid al-Tasawwuf, you can't sum that book up by Ahmed Zarruq. Couldn't sum it up. Very difficult to do that. So it's important to have a dictionary and then a good etymological dictionary to deal with terms. So now let me just look at some of the things that he says in here. And then I'm going to do a poem with you. I'm going to actually do this in 2 classes because the book can't be, there's a lot in here. And I want you all to read this if you haven't already read it. And if you can, I would get the first edition. You have to buy it used. Problem is, if you all buy it at once, it shoots up in price because used books, now they've got the computers, so they're very aware of movement with a book. Right? Suddenly it's like $7 and it shoots up to $99 because they're limited. But the 1940, the first edition is, I think, much better. I've read both of them. I had to read the Van Doren version in college. But this one, I think, is a much better edition. But one of the things that he argues in here, at the outset, he talks about reading, and then he talks about reading as learning, and he says that there's no such thing as passive reading. You can't read passively. There's only more active reading. But reading is an activity. Watching a film can be completely passive because you're just you're receptive, and it can stimulate you. You can at the emotional level. Some films can stimulate you intellectually. I mean, some films, a film like Redbeard by Kurosawa is, I think, as edifying as a lot of books. In just terms of and great film directors. They have a purpose in making their films. They're not making their films simply to entertain, although that's one level that the film could be taken on. But one of the things that he says in here is that he realized after he'd gotten his degree that he was actually a poor reader. He's got his PhD, and he was put into this class to teach. And he said that he'd read these books again, and he realized he hadn't really read them the first time. He thought he had. And then he was teaching in this seminar with Van Doren. And what happened was, he said he started reading commentaries and encyclopedia articles about the books. And so he would come thinking he was really prepared. But he said most of the good students had already done that. And he said what would happen is they would end up discussing things about the book, but they weren't discussing the book. And he said what really, and he's very humble in that he mentions that it was a great blessing for him to have been exposed. He says, fortunately for me, I was found out, or else I might have been satisfied with getting by as a teacher just as I had got by as a student. If I had succeeded in fooling others, I might soon have deceived myself as well. My first good fortune was in having a colleague in his teaching, Mark Van Doren, the poet. He led off in the discussion of poetry, as I was supposed to do in the case of history, science, and philosophy. He was several years my senior, probably more honest than I am, certainly a better reader. Forced to compare my performance with him, I simply could not fool myself. I had not found out what the books contained by reading them, but by reading about them. So he realized he really hadn't read these books because And this is why textbooks, you see, the reason that you study textbooks, do you know why you study textbooks? You know why they, other than the money that the textbook industry makes because you can't copyright old books, other than the money they make. And that's why they change them every year. They have new, even though no new information, they just change them so they make money. But you know why you read textbooks? You don't know? Anybody?
Here's a summary of the books that are read.
It's basically so-called experts that have read the original books in that field and they summarize the knowledge for you. It's digest knowledge. So what they're saying is, you're too stupid, you know, to really to read original source material. So we're going to give you this dumbed down version. But what's happened consistently over time is they keep having to meet more and more dumb because they're not challenging people. And so people become lazier and lazier to the point that basically what you're reading is tertiary, you know, thought about something, and you're reading it in a prose that is prosaic at best. It's bad. It's just bad. There's no voice, right? I mean, if you're used to good literature, Rashida, you've read good literature, right? How do you feel about textbooks? It's torture, isn't it? I can't read textbooks. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't read them. Because they're so, you know, it's like some guy that memorized Strunk and White and practiced every single rule in that book. You know, and so technically, you know, there's no grammatical mistakes generally because they're well edited and everything. But there's no voice. Whereas if you read, who would you rather read in grammar? You know, Ahmed Fouda, some guy from Egypt who was born in 1970? Or would you rather read Ibn Hisham, one of the greatest grammarians that ever lived? I mean, who would you rather read? Seriously. Who would you rather read about, you know, the philosophy of history? Some guy who read Ibn Khaldun? Or would you rather read Ibn Khaldun? Because Ibn Khaldun's not that hard. I've read him. I know he's not that hard, right? So you know, that's one of the things about forcing yourself to read these books and not read what other people say about these books. You read them for yourselves and you learn how to read them. And so you have to learn certain skills to read these books. And then this is what he goes. Now the other thing he talks about is dead and living teachers. And he says that in reality the dead teachers aren't dead teachers. You know, in this culture they talk about dead white men. You know that phrase? Which is not really fair to these people because they act as if somehow these dead white men are the reason for all this. You know, there's this kind of let's get rid of dead white men because all the problems came from these dead white men. The fact is, this civilization has consistently ignored most of those dead white men. I mean, this civilization has happened in spite of them because many of them were persecuted, literally killed. Right? They weren't popular people. Spinoza was kicked out. Right? They weren't popular people. Locke had to flee England from political persecution. Right? Socrates was killed by the noble people of Athens. But we have dead brown men. Right? That's our tradition. We've got this whole tradition of, I mean, this is largely written. We don't have that many women that wrote. We do have some women that wrote. In Kitab al-Aghani, there were many female scholars, but the women tended to be, you know, you have to have a certain type of jara'a in Arabic, like a bravado to write a book. Because writing a book is it's really, not only is it putting yourself on the line, but it's also, there's a certain assumption that you're qualified to do something, and the women tended to be very humble. It wasn't that they weren't great scholars. They had a lot of great scholars, but their nature was more humble in that. So it wasn't that there weren't great women scholars. There were, but they tended not to write. And a lot of them focused on areas like sirah, hadith, great muhaddithat, several of them. And some of the fuqaha, Imam al-Tahawi's mother, al-Tahawi, was one of the great fuqaha quoted in the books of fiqh of the Shafi'i school. But generally, you're looking at a tradition that was largely written by men. And that's something to take into consideration critically when you read, because men have a certain view that women don't always have. The Prophet ﷺ used to take counsel from the women, listen to the women. he would have the women come. They had Khatibatun Nisa. She used to come, make declarations on the women's behalf. And the Prophet would force the Sahaba to listen to her, and then he'd ask, what do you think? And they would all be, well, it's amazing, because they weren't used to having that voice. So, but he talks about dead and living teachers, and one of the things he says is that reading a book is like reading nature. The questions you ask, you have to answer yourself. When you ask questions of a book, you have to answer them yourself. Whereas in a lecture, you can stop me and say, what did you mean by that? And I can explain it to you. Right? So a living teacher is very beneficial in that they can really help you to understand some things. So, and he talks about, long before the magazine existed, live teachers earned their living by being readers' digests. Right? In other words, a lot of what teachers and lecturers did is that they learned all these things and then they were able to transmit them to other students. But in the end, the work, you have to do the work. All right, what time is it? Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is, this is just part one of this lecture. But I'll go over quickly. He said that there's three basic ways of reading a book that's worth reading. And he talks about, that you have to read it structurally, which is, he uses the metaphor of architecture, which is a good metaphor. So what you understand is the architecture of the book, because any great book is written with a structure in mind. If you read Imam al-Ghazali's book, the Ihya has extraordinary structure, and he articulates it early on in the book. If you look at, he has 40 books. There's a reason why he put, what's book 20 in the Ihya? Do you know? Does anybody know book 20? Nope. What's book 20? Nobody? Book 20 is the book of the Prophet's character. So he puts that right at the heart of the book. Right? Out of 40 books, he puts it right at the heart, because that's the heart of that whole opus. Well, what he's saying is, here's the embodiment of everything that I'm talking about. All these virtues, all these qualities that I'm telling you to inculcate, this is the one you should emulate in them. But he's got 4 books, so he does quartet. And there's a reason why he has a quartet. I mean, there's a reason why we have 4 movements in music as well. 4 is a very interesting number, and they were very interested in numbers. There's 4 amzija, right? The mizaj. There's 4 seasons, right? So 4 is very important in the life of man, because we have 4 basic seasons in our lives. We have our childhood, we have our adulthood, maturity, and then we have our fall, right? And then you have your winter, your last period. And so he puts these in the 4, and then he's got, the first is the book of knowledge. That's where he starts, because he's going to define for you, this is Ihya Ulum ad-Din. But before I'm going to show you how to revive these sciences, I have to tell you what the ilm is. Because this is a book about knowledge. So I'm going to define my terms. Right? So it's a very structured book. So you have to look at the structure of a book. Now, some books are very nice in that they give you what are called analytical chapter summaries. So you have like a chapter heading, and then you have the analytical summary. So the author is telling you, here, this is what this chapter is about. You'll get that. But you should be doing that work. You have to really break down a chapter, right? So looking at the structure of it. And then you have to look also, the second type is the analytical, the interpretive, where you really have to see what the author is saying, what's going on, right? And then finally a critical reading, which is where you begin to engage in a these are the 3 types that he said every book has to be read 3 times. The first is to get the structure, the second is to understand the book, and the third is to have a conversation with the book. And you can only, he said a lot of people will jump to the 3rd reading. They'll read it critically without really understanding it. And that's where you get people, oh, that book, it's rubbish. Why? Oh, because, the author's full of it, whatever. but have they really understood the author's positions? Because in a lot of cases they haven't. You know, there's people that are entrenched in ideological positions. If I'm a Keynesian, any monetarist that I read, I'm just going to disagree with him off the bat. But if I don't have a position economically, maybe I'm a Keynesian, but I'm open to persuasion. You know, persuade me that monetarist policies are better than Keynesian. Or maybe there's a third way. Maybe there's some synthesis out of this dialectic. Or maybe, there's a fourth, a fifth, or a sixth way. Maybe we can think outside of the box, right? But if I'm entrenched in a certain ideological viewpoint, there's no way I'm going to be able to read a book with an open mind. So that's one of the things, suspending your criticism, charitable reading, all right? So basically what I want to do now before we end is I want to look at that poem. So could everybody read? This is a poem by Piercy by Shelley, because reading poems are like reading a book in miniature. You know, a poem is really like a book, all right, because it's so packed with meaning. Poets are, I could write a whole book, and I'm not exaggerating. I could write a book commenting on this poem. I guarantee you, I know I could. I could write a book just commenting on this poem. That's how much meaning I consider to be in this poem. This is the reason I like this poem. It was the first poem when I was 12 years old. I was in 13. I was 13 years old in 8th grade, Mrs. Augustinelli's class. She was my English teacher. And I read this poem, and it gave me goosebumps. It's the first poem that ever really affected me like that, right? So for me, it has a lot of meaning in that way. But anyway, some people, he's from the Romantics, Piercy by Shelley, famous for marrying the woman that wrote a famous novel, right? Frankenstein. Anyway, these guys were very critical of a lot of things. But so just read it, and just give you a minute or two. Just read it and think about it. Do you have a copy? Yeah. So, if you had to say in one word what you felt reading that poem, what would it be? That's like, yeah. I guess if you hyphenated them, we could consider them one word. Yeah. Okay. Why? What's the feeling? What did you feel? Have you read it before?
No.
No. So it's the first time you ever read it. Okay. It's a famous poem. So what did you feel?
Overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It was just like so much meaning in every single line that it was just like overwhelming. And
what most struck you about it?
How I think it's kind of random, but at the same time it was just I I don't know what was the main point, but
Okay.
I feel like every single line was the main point.
Okay. Can anybody identify what you think the main point is? Rashida, what do you think the main point is in here?
I think the main point, well, for me it was kind of like this irony, like here you
It's definitely a very ironic poem. Yeah. And what's the central irony?
that Ozymandias basically constructed this king of kings greater than anything
Yeah.
persona, and what's left of him is a broken down statue.
Yes. In the middle of these, yeah. There's nothing there. Round the decay, right? That colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Yeah. So,
Can you recite the poem, Sheikh Hamza, for the people?
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." That's the quotation. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So it's definitely an ironic poem. Now, if you get into are there any words that Ozymandias is actually a real name? Because this was during the British when they were beginning to discover Egypt, and they were coming back. They were actually bringing things back as well, but they were discovering, and so they had these travel logs. It was very popular to read about their experiences going up the Nile and seeing all these incredible Egyptian ruins of the pharaohs, and it became in England it was a big deal. And so he's writing this poem about somebody who's come back, and he's telling him about his experience, right? And he's going to tell him about this. He was out in the desert, right? And then he saw this two vast and trunkless legs of stone, right? Trunkless legs of stone. It's amazing, trunkless. Like there's no body, just the legs of stone are there, right? Stand in the desert, right? They're standing there without a trunk, right? Near them, and then nearby on the sand, half sunk. And another really strong, and you can see the trunk sunk. You see these are the internal rhymes of the poem. I mean, these are he could have said he could have described half buried, he could have said, right? But he didn't. He said half sunk. A shattered visage lies. And sunk is something we normally think of the sea, right? Something sinks in water, but here's sand. There's another type of water, the water of earth, right? Half sunk, a shattered visage, right? What's a visage? It's the face, right? And this is important because, that's an older word we don't know. So you have to know why he's using a visage, right? Lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. What's he telling us about this guy? His character, right? Tell that its sculptor well those passions read, right? The sculptor really understood something about this character, right? Whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. I mean, sneer, it's an interesting word, right? What does sneer mean? What do you do when you sneer at somebody? It's contemptuous, right? Arrogance, just sneering. Right? Sneer of cold command, heartless. We're dealing with a heartless person here. Tell that its sculptor well those passions read. I mean, here we have reading, right? The artist reads also. It's a different type of reading. He's reading into the personality of the character that he's sculpting. He read well those passions because he's put them on that face. And then what's he telling us? Passions are, when you think of passion, what do you think of? Huh? Well, what do you think though? Passions. Like somebody's passionate, what are they? Huh? Yeah, but what? Passion. He's got so much passion. Huh? I mean, I think of life, somebody who's really alive. You know, they're passionate, they're alive, right? So it's interesting, he's juxtaposing here, you know, to tell that it's sculpted well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. So here he's juxtaposing passions with lifeless, and yet he's telling us they survive. How have they survived? The sculpture. You see, so this is Shelley's own little, we're getting into his philosophy now, because Shelley was a romantic and believed that in the immortality of art, that art was one way of achieving immortality. And so what he's saying is, look, Ozymandias doesn't really live anymore except because of this artist, right? So the artist actually outlived Ozymandias because he's the one that left behind this thing. It wasn't Ozymandias. He paid for it, but it was the artist that produced it, right? So he's that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mock them. What do you think he means there? Mock them. And the heart that fed. What does he mean, the hand that mocked them? What does mocked mean? What's mock mean? There's another poem, great poem, one of my favorite poems by Yeats. Come, let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind, nor thought of the leveling wind. Come, let us mock at the good with all those come, let us mock at the good with all those calendars whereon they fixed old aching eyes, nor thought of how the seasons run and now but gape at the sun. Come, let us mock at the wise that fancied goodness might be gay and sick of solitude might proclaim a holiday. Wind shrieked, and where are they? Mockers after that, who would not lift a hand maybe to bar that foul storm out, who would not lift a hand maybe to help the good, wise, or great to bow that foul storm out, for we traffic in mockery. Right? He's talking about the modern age. It's all mockery. Let's just make fun of everybody, make fun of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, it's an age of mockery. Make fun, everybody's open game. Make fun of politicians, make fun of everybody's open game for mockery. But is that what he's saying here, the hand that mocked them? See, this is importance of knowing terms. Yeah, that's what he means. He means more imitate, because that, you know, in his time, mock also meant to copy or to imitate. The hand that copied them, because he wasn't mocking. He wasn't mocking Ozymandias. So this is important. You can't understand something unless you know the words that the author is using in it. So here he means the hand that copied them. Now what's he mean, the heart that fed?
Wait, the hand that mocked them referring to the words? Or
The passions. Yeah, he copied those passions. He nailed them. He got them on that face in stone. Right? The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. What's the heart that fed? Fed what? The passion. So it's the heart of Ozymandias. He got his heart. It's a cold heart. It's a contemptuous heart. It's a heart that, you know, it looks down, it frowns on things. Not a happy heart. And on the pedestal, these words appear. I mean, what do we put up on pedestals, right? On the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. You know, you'll never be able to achieve what I achieve. Despair, mighty. He's talking to the mighty. He's not talking to the peasants. He's talking to other kings. I'm king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, not peasants. You know, they're all shaking in their boots. I'm talking about the mighty should look at me and who I am. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And then boom, he's got the exclamation mark, right? And then what? Nothing beside remains. It's just such a beautiful turn of phrase to come right after that. You know, nothing beside remains. That's it. Right? Round the decay of that colossal wreck, right? This giant Ozymandias. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the level sands, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So what's he mean, boundless and bare? The lone and level sands stretch far away. What are the sands referring to?
The area around.
It's the desert, right? But what do you think? What do we think of sands also? The sands of time, right? So it's time. It levels everything. Everything we build, it's all going to be leveled. Time is the great leveler. So, you know, he's basically just saying, look, nothing beside remains. It's all boundless and bare. The lone and level sands that stretch far away. There's just this little half-sunk visage in the midst of a massive ocean called time, that no matter what we do, it's always going to be this half-sunk, shattered visage in the ocean of time, the sands of time, right? In the end. Pretty bleak. Unless, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Unless people are building not for this world. Because all these things that you do here become meanings in the next world. Everything you do here is meaningful in the next world. That's another view. Anyway, so any questions, any answers?
There's definitely some questions
On the,
from some of the viewers.
okay, let's hear it. Yeah.
Muhammad Rizal asks, can you ask Shaykh Hamza what he thinks of speed reading?
Yeah. Speed reading is like trying to read on methamphetamines. I don't believe in speed reading. I think you can speed read a blog, not my blogs. You can speed read a blog. You can speed read an article in Time or Newsweek, something like that. You know, there's things you could read. There's skimming and then there's superficial reading. Skimming is just scrolling down a page and, you know, trying to see, do I really want to read this or not? And then superficial reading is to read it without really thinking about it, right? Whereas real reading takes time. I mean, real readers are, you know, if you're going to read something in the way he's talking about, Adler recommends not reading more than 20 pages an hour and taking a break. I mean, that's, you know, that's slow reading. So, you know, but I mean, you know, my teachers, like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bay, he reads all the time. Amazing. He always takes books with him. And Marabt al-Hajj, I brought him once a 3-volume book of Al-Wazani as a gift. It was a book of fatwas that he didn't have, and it's a famous one that's quoted. He just, for the next 3 weeks, that's all he read when he had free time, and he finished it in like 3 weeks. Mind you, he's reading something that he knows a lot about, so it depends on also what you're reading. Adler talks about, you know, original communication, which are primary texts, because there's authors that are giving you original thought. And most books don't have a lot of original thought in them, because it's just not, very few humans have really original things to say. And a lot of them are actually just rehashing things that have already been said, but because people don't know tradition. You know, Mark Twain said, the ancients stole all their best ideas from us. Right? I mean, there's a lot of truth to that statement, you know, because people don't know where things come from. And so they read something and they think, wow, that's amazing. But then you read Aristotle and you'll see like, oh, that's where he got it from. You know, So that happens. Anyway, so I mean, I took a speed reading course in school that I had to take when I was in school, and maybe I didn't have to take it, but I think I did actually, because it was part of, because I was a tutor when I was in school in the reading lab. But I wouldn't recommend speed reading. I'm not a fast reader. I actually read really slow. I look up words too. Like if I don't know a word, I'll look it up, which slows you down. You know, I mean, I have a pretty good vocabulary, but you know, there's words, I still come across words all the time that I either don't know, or I'm not quite sure, or I can't remember. You know, it's like, because you have passive and active vocabulary. Active vocabulary is what you use. Passive is what you can recognize and understand when you hear it or read it. And our passive vocabularies are much larger than our active vocabularies. I mean, our active vocabularies are usually limited to about 2,000 or 3,000 words. But our passive, active. Our passive ones, you know, you're talking a lot of words. People know a lot of words, surprisingly. I mean, even, you know, relatively uneducated people know a lot of words, and also a lot of nuances. And I mean, what the average person knows is just phenomenal. That's why people are brilliant. Humans are. We're not stupid. We're very smart. You know, and memory, people say, I don't have a good memory. Rubbish. You remember so many things. It's amazing. You can all leave this room, and I can ask you to tell me basically what's in this room, and you remember it. I mean, how did that happen? Just from being in a room to know, you know, where the podium was, you know, where the books were, approximately how many of those shelves are in here, you know, where the table was, where, you know, we can describe those kiosks, those little cubicles in the thing, right? And there's a little guest book on the thing, right? And then I saw a little poster. You can go there now if it's still there, you know, a little poster about building Zaytuna brick by brick. I mean, I was just walking into a room and I noticed all these things. I mean, how did that get stuck in there? People have phenomenal memories. We just don't know how to utilize our memories, like we don't know how to read. These things are trained. You know, memory is you train your memory. It's a skill. So anyway, any other questions?
One of our students who is joining us online says, in regards to reading higher level books and primary sources, isn't it helpful to rely on something that is a little easier to understand as a means of gaining familiarity with the material and then heading into more difficult original texts? Otherwise, it would seem to be a barrier to learning if an individual becomes overwhelmed or give up. Thanks.
You know, I would say it depends on what you're reading. I mean, for instance, you know, I'm reading a book right now that I've read before, but I'm reading it with somebody, and it's a book by Imam al-Bajuri. And Imam al-Bajuri assumes in that book, and it's really a secondary book because he's drawing from a lot of different books, and it's a textbook. It was used in Al-Azhar for Aqidah. But in that book, he's assuming that you know logic, rhetoric, grammar, philology, ilm al-wada'. He's assuming that you know theology, because it's an intermediate theology book. So he's assuming you've had basic theology. So he makes all these assumptions on his reader. Now, if you knew Arabic pretty well, you could actually read the book, but you would be missing a lot of his nuances. You just would, and then you'll miss things like he'll use a word that you won't know that he's using it to refer to something else, a science as a technical term, because that's one of the things about knowing terms. Now, one of the things that he's going to argue in here is that you have to also, in the second level of reading, you have to be able to identify terms and propositions and arguments. And these are basically the three subjects of logic: understanding, judgment, and reasoning. Those are the three subjects that logic deals with. Understanding is what are called simple apprehensions, knowing terms, what's called in Arabic logic tasawwur, being able to conceptualize something. And the Arabs say, they say that al-hukmu ala shay'in far'un an tasawwurihi. in order to judge something, judging a thing is a branch of its conceptualization. That you have to conceptualize something before you can make a proposition. So you have to know, if I say all men are created equal, okay, I have to know what men, all men, that's a universal statement. So I mean every man. Does that include black people? At a certain time, maybe people wouldn't have agreed that, right? But now most people, right, would include that. Does that include, Arabs? Does that include, right? So when we say all men, we're talking about everybody, right? Irrespective of what people went 200 years ago when they declared that. They didn't think that that was a universal statement. Jefferson did, right? And Benjamin Rush and others, but not all of them. I mean, I'm sure they didn't. But you make that same, you have to know what they mean by all men. And then what do they mean created equal? Equal is a mathematical term, and they're using it in a philosophical statement. So, I mean, are we equal? Like, you're taller than me, aren't you? Stand up.
Yeah, I think so.
He's taller than me, isn't he? So we're not equal. So all men are not created equal. He's taller than me, right? So what do I mean by equal here? What am I talking about? These are terms. You have to understand the terms before you can make the proposition. So is it a mathematical metaphor? Am I saying created is assuming God too, right? Because created means it's a passive form that assumes a creator, right? Because created means to be made. So something was made has to have a maker. That's an assumption. And they believed it because they are endowed by their creator. They mentioned the creator right after that, right? So that's a proposition. All men are created equal. Is it a true proposition? In modal logic, you have what are called modalities. So it depends on what you're talking about. Because people aren't created. Some people are faster than others, taller than others, smarter than others. We're not all created equal. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about with our basic human dignity? So there's a proposition. Is that what he meant? Maybe. We need to discuss it. So you have to know the terms and then the proposition. Now, he's making an argument. That's a proposition. It's a categorical statement, right? It's a declarative statement. All men are created equal. He's not saying maybe all men are created equal. I think all men are created equal. In my opinion, all men are created equal. Those are different ways of saying it. He's saying all men are created equal. Categorical, declarative, universal statement. We have to know what those terms are, and then we have to know, okay, what's his reasoning? What's his reasoning? So now that's the third level. So that's a science that, inshallah, you guys are going to learn before you get out of here, because it's very important. One of the things about logic is no longer taught generally, and it's created a lot of havoc because people can't think anymore clearly, and our tradition is very committed to logic. I mean, the Shamsiyya was almost a universal, the Sulam in North Africa. I mean, one of the things about Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya that makes him distinct amongst a lot of scholars I've seen is he really knows logic really well. So when he reasons, it's like knowing chess. Logic's like knowing chess, but you don't just know the rules, because we can all reason. I mean, we're humans. Like you can make an argument, People make arguments all the time. But there's a difference between knowing the rules of chess and knowing the strategies of chess, right? Because if you know the strategies of chess, you can end a chess match in about 3 or 4 moves with somebody who doesn't know the strategies of chess. And logic is not simply to win arguments. It's really a means, a tool to pursue the truth. And that's why, that's one of the things he says, that you should not ever want to read a book critically just to win an argument with the author. No, you should be open to being convinced. Imam Shafi'i said, I never debated anybody, but I hoped and prayed that the truth would manifest on his tongue, so I would have to submit to it. And that's a whole other way of looking at this thing. But he's assuming that, traditionally people studied grammar, rhetoric, logic. They understood conditional sentences. They understood universals, particulars. They understood definitions, amphiboles, equivocations. All these type of things are really important in language. And they're tools of learning that you need to acquire. And the better you get at them, the better you'll be at reading, and the better you'll be at critical reading. Because one of the things about all these men, that one of the things that they share, if you go into any of these books, like Imam Sawi, wrote this book as a commentary on his Sheikh's book. He is going to assume that you understand, logic. I mean, he's just going to assume it. And he's going to assume that you understand, وقوله أي الكثير كما فسر ابن فرحون معنى الغالب وقيل معنى الغالب أي في إطلاق لفظ الجيد عليه كما فسر به الباجي. So now he's defining what's he mean by الكثير. وحمل في الجيد على الغالب منه في البلد وحمل في الرديء على الغالب أي الكثير منه في البلد وإلا يغلب شيء فالوسط من الجيد ومن الرديء يقضي به. So these are all terms that you have to understand. He's talking about jayyid of food stuff, the good of a food stuff, right? And the radi is the lower quality. على الغالب أي الكثير منه في البلد, the majority of it in a country. إلا يغلب الشيء فالوسط من الجيد أو من الردي يقضى به. So you can also use what's between the two. And then he goes further into the commentary. الكثير here, according to Ibn Farhun, means the same, الغالب. And some say it means as في إطلاق لفظ الجيد عليه. It's the ghalib of the jayyid only. So, these are this is like a telegraph. I mean, he's using, it's like texting. He's using minimal language there. And that's the way the later writers are. The earlier writers are much easier to read. But they're just, they kept distilling it, right? Because here, see, when he wrote this book, this is 6 volumes. When he wrote this book, it was assumed that you memorize the text. This is a commentary on a text that's about 150 pages. And he assumed you memorize the text. And then what the commentary is those are for the text to be memory pegs for the meanings. But this book is a condensation of another book, which is called the Mudawwana, right? Which should be here somewhere. Anyway, the Mudawwana is like about this size. So they took the Mudawwana and took it down to about this size. So they took a book like this and summarized it to this and then had to write this to explain it. So you're back where you started. But the reason they did that was because in the old days they actually memorized this. And they couldn't do that anymore. So they started writing these abridgments to keep the memory, to simplify it. So even though it was much smaller, it was actually a lot harder than this. But the memory was easier. And so this was just to explain what you had memorized, because people couldn't memorize that anymore. So that's the way the Muslim tradition kind of got into these summaries and glosses on glosses and went like that. But they're assuming at this level, he's writing in the 200 years ago, he's assuming that you have mastered a certain set of sciences. And he's not writing for some guy that's got a secondary degree from, high school or even a college degree now at Ain Shams or at Damascus University. They can't read these books. You have to study people, you have to study with people who have studied the books. And that's why the ulama say, and he talks about that. He said some books you need a teacher. They're just not going to work without a teacher. He says if it's a great book, generally it should be understandable. It's a lot harder with a teacher, without a teacher, but he said you can do it if you put the work in it. And that's true. But I'll conclude, I know there's a lot of questions, but I'll conclude. Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, one of the great scholars of Islam, he said, يظن الغمر أن الكتب تهدي أخ فهم لإدراك العلوم. That simple people think, inexperienced people think that books will lead the one of intellect to understanding. يظن الغمر أن الكتب تهدي أخ فهم لإدراك العلوم. You'll come to know these knowledges, right? وما يدري بأن فيها غوامض حيرت عقل الفهيم. وما يدري الجهول بأن فيها غوامض حيرت عقل الفهيم. But the ignoramus doesn't know that in these books are ambiguities that will confuse even the most intelligent of people. إذا رمت العلوم بغير شيخ ضللت عن الصراط المستقيم وتلتبس الأمور عليك حتى تسير أضل من توم الحكيم. If you try to learn this knowledge, you know, revelation and the knowledges that go with it, if you try to learn this without a teacher, you will go astray. And affairs will become so confusing to you that you'll be more astray than Thomas the physician. And it's referring to a famous Arabic tradition of Toma al-Hakim. He was a man who inherited books from his father. His father was a physician who died. He inherited his library. So he read and learned medicine through books. And he had a book that said, Al-Habbatu Sawda Dawa'un min kulli da. The black seed is a cure for every disease. But there were two dots. The scrivener put two dots instead of one on Habba. So it said, Al-Hayatu Sawda. The black snake is a cure for every disease. So he went to find a black snake, and they call it black mamba. It's a very poisonous snake. And he tried to catch it, and it bit him, and he died. So that's their metaphor for... Anyway, subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan. So I'm going to do, the next one it'll be a continuation on this, but I'm going to go into more detail, and we'll do some more poems, and also I'm going to read with you a speech to analyze as well. All right? BarakAllahu feekum. Harun, shukran. Oh.
Bismillah. Sorry, it's just it's very hard, obviously, to follow that. Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Hamza, for the amazing intellectual journey we just went on. Jazakumullah khair, everyone, for being here. Please, everyone, consider joining us here at Zaytuna for the intellectual journeys that happen here, and for supporting this. And please see the website and the Facebook page for information about the next lecture. Jazakumullah khair.
Zaytuna College is investing in a new home in Berkeley, California. Join us on February 18th for a benefit dinner featuring Shaykh Hamza Yusuf and Hatem Bazian, and find out how you can dedicate a brick to be permanently displayed at the new campus. Register today.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen wa ala ashabihi wa alihi ajma'in. In the name of God, the all-merciful, the most compassionate, all praise belongs to Him, and we ask Him to send peace and prayers upon our Prophet Muhammad, upon his family and his companions. This is part 2 of Shaykh Hamza Yusuf's lecture on how to read a book. I want to first welcome everyone for coming here to the Zaytuna Library, or for being with us online or after the fact on YouTube perhaps. Part 1 was delivered last Wednesday. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I highly encourage that you take a look at it online. One of the many benefits we could take from what Shaykh Hamza mentioned last Wednesday was the importance of being present and active in reading, and indeed in everything that we do. And so it's here that I emphasize the importance of us all just being present and active in this talk today. Whether you're here present, or watching it after the fact online, or watching it live streamed right now. First of all, presence. If there's something else on your mind, if you're working on something else, have homework, have food in front of you, or if on your mind is homework or food or a conversation you just had with someone, put it all aside and let us be present in what's about to be said, and really engaging with it and thinking about it. Also being active. If you don't already have so in front of you, please take a notebook and write down ideas you have in which you can apply the things that Shaykh Hamza is about to say, and ideas that you have in terms of applying these things towards and implementing them in the rest of your life. Also, consider being active with Zaytuna. We couldn't do this, have talks like this, make videos like this, if it weren't for your support. So please keep us in your prayers, help us with financial support, and then also consider applying or encouraging others to apply to Zaytuna College. And thank you for everyone who's been supporting us throughout our whole time here at Zaytuna. Without further ado, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf.
All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Okay, what I'd like to do today, I talked last week about the 3 types of reading that Dr. Adler describes in his book. And just to give you a little background on how this book came about, because it's actually, I think, a very important book. A lot of people that I know that I really respect in their abilities as scholars actually said that this was one of the books that really benefited them. So it's a very useful book. But how it came about, I mentioned last week that he had a course where he had to teach these books. And what happened during the course was he realized that he hadn't really read the books. At least he hadn't read them at a deep level. But he says something very interesting, and I want to show you how the Islamic element comes in, because our tradition is a tradition of reading. The very first word in the Islamic tradition is iqra. I mean, that's really the starting of the whole thing, is read. And there is no community in human history, I think, that has been more committed to the word and the idea of the power and presence of language than the Islamic civilization. And the Muslims just left behind this incredible legacy of language, this commitment to language. So I want to just, Adler says, he talks about the Middle Ages and how we have this kind of prejudice towards it. And he says in here, in the late Middle Ages, there were men who could read better than the best readers today. Right? In the late Middle Ages, there were men who could read better than the best readers today. Of course, it is true that there were fewer men who could read, that they had fewer books to read, and that they depended upon reading more than we do as a source of learning. The point remains, however, that they mastered the books they valued as we master nothing today. We actually do, sports is definitely an area of mastery today. And to some degrees, entertainment. There's some really exceptional entertainers, but we tend to be, mastery in our culture has been reduced to amusement. There's a mastery of those who amuse us and entertain us. But the idea of intellectual mastery is actually really, really relegated to the hard sciences. There's definitely people in the hard sciences that master things, but these were people committed to a whole other different level of mastery. And what he says is, maybe we do not respect any book as they valued the Bible, the Quran, or the Talmud. All right, so, and he actually had a lot of respect for the Islamic tradition because I knew him personally, and he was very aware. He knew Averroes, he knew Avicenna. But here's what he says now, which I find very fascinating. He says, we must get over all our funny prejudices about the Middle Ages and go to the men who wrote exegeses of Scripture, in other words, commentary on Scripture, glosses on Justinian, or commentaries on Aristotle for the most perfect models of reading. These glosses and commentaries were not condensations or digests. They were analytical and interpretive readings of a worthy text. In fact, I might as well confess here that I have learned much of what I know about reading from examining a medieval commentary. All right, so this is where he learned how to read, by looking at how these scholastic churchmen and also because he mentions the commentaries on Aristotle, and I actually had one, I think I left it in the car, but the great commentaries on Aristotle were from Averroes, and they were translated into Latin. And this really changed European tradition when the Islamic language tradition is introduced into European tradition, because the Muslims were the first people that did serious dictionaries. You can find no tradition of dictionaries before the Muslims that is scientific. There's Chinese dictionaries, but if you look at them compared to how the Muslims actually, the first dictionaries emerged already in the late 7th century. So even the Jewish scholars actually woke up to the idea of writing all the words down and putting them in a book from the Muslims. And it's well known that in Jewish tradition, they actually go to Arabic dictionaries to see root words in their own tradition. And this is something that the great medieval scholastics from the Jewish tradition did. So he says, right, the rules I am going to prescribe are simply a formulation of the method I have observed in watching a medieval teacher read a book with his students. Now, the beauty of this is this tradition is still alive. Like, because I've read many books with scholars, like literally sit down and read the whole book with a scholar who read the book with a scholar. And this is an element that he won't bring in to this book, but this I think is the fourth level of reading, which is the idea of the chain or the isnad, and the idea of maintaining a certain interpretive consistency because of the chain. This is really important. And there's a reason, you see, one of the secrets of this community that's, to me, is probably one of the most fascinating aspects of the Islamic community, is that a normative tradition emerges out of Islam that was not predicated on the Christian or the Jewish tradition of the synods and the councils. The Christians had to get together and really argue out their doctrines. So you have the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, you have all these different councils where all the church fathers come together and they actually debate about what they're going to believe and what's going to be normative in their practice. There's no historical evidence that any of that ever occurred in Islam, and yet a normative tradition emerges, which is very unusual. And the reason it emerges is because of the isnad. You see, this is the secret of this community. And our scholars have said this, that the isnad is the secret of this ummah, is the idea that you have these chains. And that's why, you see, the Quran, why is there no difference of opinion about how the Quran is recited? Why is it that the Shia, and all the variants of Shia, so the Ibadi, the Khawarij, the Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi'i, the Zaydi, all of them read the Quran with the same makharij. They all agree. There's 17 makharij. They agree on the 5 points of articulation. They agree that on the huruf al-halq, you have hamza, ha, you have ha and ayn, and then you have kha and ghayn. Why do they agree on those points of articulation? Then they agree on the sifat. I mean, why is that? There's no difference of opinion about these things, even in the variant readings. And this is because of the isnad, because the same people taught in each generation, and they assured a consistency of transmission, right? So one of the things about reading books that deal with very, very complicated things, that there's so much room for misinterpretation. So when you bring in the interpretive element, and you see, if we look here, right, and this is a book I know pretty well. This is a book interpreting the hadith from an accepted Imam Abdul Ra'uf, Muhammad Abdul Ra'uf al-Munawi, right? So when we go to a hadith, إذا استيقظ الرجل من الليل وأيقظ أهله وصليا ركعتين كتب من الذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات. If a man wakes up at night and then he gets his wife up and the two of them pray 2 rakats, it will be written for them that they're from the people who remember God a lot, men and women, all right? And then he tells you who it's from, and that it's from Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu, and then he tells you, and also Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, and then he tells you that it's a sahih hadith. He gives you an ishara. Now if you go down, he says, إِذَا اسْتَيْقَظَ الرَّجُلُ مِنَ اللَّيْلِ أي انتبه من نومه من الليل أو في الليل أو ليلا. فمن تبعيضية أو بمعنى في. قال الولي العراقي يحتمل أنها للابتداء الغاية من غير تقدير، وهذا معنى التهجد عرفا. فإنه see this is a tradition. All those things have meaning. So he's saying, in other words, انتبه, like he استيقظ انتبه. He enters into consciousness after being unconscious. من نومه من الليل أو في الليل, from part of the night or in the night or at night. So he gives all these different possibilities using these adverbs and prepositions. So it could be adverbally, it could be using the preposition for partitive, right? A part of the night, right? And then he says, or it could be بمعنى في. So he's saying من الليل could be, it could mean here في, it could mean a part of the night, right? So, and then he says, الولي العراقي says, ويحتمل أنها لابتداء الغاية. It's probable that it's for ابتداء الغاية, because you can have min al-ibtida. So now he's saying the min here could mean fi, it could mean partitive, so it could be adverbial, in the night, it could be partitive, or it could be the from of outset. In other words, I began, ataytu min Mecca, I came from Mecca, from the outside. So here he's exhausting the linguistic meanings. He's saying, look, all these meanings are possible in this preposition. He's teaching you how to read with all the ambiguities that language has. He's exhausting the possibilities. This is a type of reading. Because he's saying, look, we can't say it's this or it's that. It could be this, it could be this, or it could be this. Because the language has all of those possibilities. And this is our tradition. It's a tradition that literally exhausted language. And that's why we have so many commentaries on the Qur'an, because this is what they were doing. But they were masters of language. They were masters of grammar, they were masters of rhetoric, and they were masters of logic. And this is what he's saying. Look, these men knew how to read in a much deeper way than we know how to read. They were exhausting language because what they were reading was so serious. Most of what we read is so frivolous, we don't need to think when we read. Because we're reading about how Whitney Houston died. You know, was it drowning or was it from the Valium that she took? Did she overdose? That's what people are reading about. You don't really have, what's exhaustive about that? It's just titillation. That's all it is. It's just to amuse and titillate people. That's all they're interested in. Now they've put her little site on the Hollywood tours now. So the bus goes by that place. There's where so-and-so died. Right? This is the culture that has been cultivated. It's a culture of frivolity where tragedy even becomes amusement and entertainment. And that's why they love to watch these people melt down. Right? Because it's a really unhealthy culture. It's unwell. So, compared to the brilliance of the 12th and 13th centuries, the present era is much more like the Dark Ages. And he's writing this in 1940. I mean, what would they think now? You know? He actually lived to be 90, 91 or 2, I think. So then he talks about the idea of having, he says when you read people like Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, John Adams, if you look at the founding fathers of this country and you actually read them, you realize that they're writing at a very sophisticated level. If you read the Federalist Papers, has anybody ever ventured into those, the Federalist Papers? Huh? A little bit? The Federalist Papers today are considered extremely hard reading for the average American, right? They were newspaper op-eds when they were written, literally. They were newspaper op-eds. They were published in the daily newspapers, or not daily, weekly, or whatever, in New York and Philadelphia. That's what they were. They were newspaper op-eds. Yet today, it's difficult for people to read them. All you have to do is take a high school textbook from the 1850s and look at the level of reading that they were doing. One of the things, for instance, if you look at McGuffey's Readers or Appleton's or any of the 19th century books that they read at the grammar school, they never taught words without teaching the accents of words. So they had this idea of elocution, what we would call tajweed, proper pronunciation, knowing the sifat al-huruf, because English also has sifat, like there's mutes and there's liquids, aspirates. Right? These are the attributes of the letters. And so to pronounce them properly, you need to learn what their qualities are. They learned those because to them, poetry was very important. And so they wanted young people to be able to identify accents and beats in poetry so that they could hear the rhythms of poetic language and they would be able to see that. If you ever get a chance, you can hear Lord Alfred Tennyson reciting The Charge of the Light Brigade, which he didn't particularly like as a poem. He wrote it as a poem for honoring the veterans of the Crimean War, where the British sided with the Muslims, quite unusual, against the Russians. But he wrote this poem, and if you hear him recite it, he says, "Cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right." And he does this very dramatic reading. Well, somebody asked him why, when he did his public readings, he did it like that. He said, well, I worked quite considerably to get those numbers, in the accents, and so I want everybody to be aware of them, because it's not easy to do that, to get a proper iamb or a dactyl or a spondy, however you're writing. So that was very important. So these people learn these things. Now, what he argues here is that people don't like this idea of uniform education anymore. So we've created an elective system where people choose what they study. And part of the argument for that, he said there's a lot of talk among liberal educators who fear the rise of fascism, because this was a concern in the 1930s and 40s, about the dangers of regimentation and indoctrination. I have already pointed out that many of them confuse discipline with the Prussian drill or the goose step. The Nazis do the goose step. They confuse authority, which is nothing but the voice of reason, with autocracy or tyranny. See, we call an author an author. There's a difference between a writer and an author. An author is called an author because they write with authority. They have some, like, if we're going to read a book on cardiac surgery, we want to know that the guy that wrote that book has a degree from an accredited medical school in cardiac surgery. We want him to have authority. We don't want to read a book by some hack writer who decided to write a book on cardiac surgery and just got a whole bunch of resources and references, and he's got no degrees, and he wrote the book. Most people in their right mind would just not take that seriously because he doesn't write with authority. He's not an author. All right? So what he says is, they confuse authority with nothing, which is nothing but the voice of reason. Right? With autocracy or tyranny. But the error they make about indoctrination is the saddest. They and most of us do not know what docility is. Okay, so what's docility? What's a docile person? Submissive, good. Yeah. What else? Docile, yeah, calm. I mean, these are the kind of images that are conjured up with a docile person. Anything else? Meek personality, right? There's a hadith, al-mu'minu hayyinu layyinun. The believer is docile. إِذَا قِيدَ انْقَادَ. If he's led, he follows. Like, that's a sahih hadith. Docile, if you look in the dictionary, the third meaning is teachable. All right? So docile is from the same root, dacere, that we get doctor from. Right? It's the ability, and also indoctrinate is related to that also. All right? But the docile person is the teachable person because they're willing to actually listen to an authority and learn from that authority. So to be docile is to be teachable. The teachable one must have the art of being taught and must practice it actively. So you have to be an active learner. Docile doesn't mean you're passive. right? It means that you're teachable. You have to be an active learner. So, the more active one is in learning from a teacher, dead or alive. In other words, these are dead teachers, even though they're these are the living teachers. I mean, most of the ones walking and talking were the dead ones. These are the ones that are alive. But he talks about dead teachers, meaning the teachers who have gone, that we can't really ask them what they meant. And the living teachers where we can, because they're still here to tell us what they meant. So he says that the more active one is learning from a teacher, dead or alive, and the more art one uses to master what he has to teach, the more docile one is. Docility, in short, is the precise opposite of passivity and gullibility. Those who lack docility, the students who fall asleep during a class, are the most likely to be indoctrinated. Lacking the art of being taught, whether that skill be in listening or in reading, they do not know how to be active in receiving what is communicated to them. Hence, they either receive nothing at all, or what they receive they absorb uncritically. Right? I mean, it's a really important point. So slighting the 3 R's in the beginning, reading, writing, and reckoning, they used to call those the 3 R's. Later they become the trivium and the quadrivium. Reading, writing, and reckoning. The 3 R's. This was the foundation of grammar school in Muslim and Christian and Jewish tradition. And neglecting the liberal arts almost entirely at the end, our present education is essentially illiberal. It's actually not creating free people. It's having the opposite effect. It's creating people that are under the illusion that they're free, but they haven't been their minds aren't free to think. Right? Hence Bob Marley, emancipate your mind from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. You know Bob Marley. So they have been, then he says, right, our students are indoctrinated with all sorts of local prejudices and pre-digested pap. Let me give you an example. If you ask most students today, are there any absolutes in the world? Most American students in Europe, they'll say, it's just, everything's relative. Like, that's your truth. Right? It's not my truth. That is a whole philosophical school. They don't know where it came from. They don't know how it entered into the DNA of our culture, but it's actually a philosophical school, and it's been around since the ancient Greeks. Socrates was dealing with these people. It's not new. It's not new. I mean, that's who Socrates is fighting in all the dialogues, in the Socratic dialogue. He's fighting those characters that say it's all relative. We've got people all over now saying it's all relative. The irony of that statement is that it's an absolute. You cannot say there are no absolutes without stating an absolute. It's one of the ironies in philosophy. So what he's saying is they have been fattened and made flabby for the demagogues to prey on. Hence people that are standing behind these demagogues with holding up signs saying yay for them. And they're just demagogues. They're not making any sense. They're not making rational arguments. I mean, if you want a rational argument about foreign policy, the single most rational argument about foreign policy that I can see is the one that Ron Paul consistently makes. And yet everybody just relegates him to kookdom. He's just saying, look, if you go around bombing people, they're going to get angry. Right? They say, no, it's just because they hate us. They hate our freedoms. Well, Scandinavia is freer than America. Right? They're not bombing Finland. Right? Seriously, it's just a kind of rational argument. But people aren't taught to think critically. They're not taught to think critically. It's rah, rah, rah. And so this is what he's talking about, the resistance to specious authority, authority that's not real authority. Even when the doctrines they impose are sound democratic ones, the schools fail to cultivate free judgment because they have forsaken discipline. They leave their students open to the opposite indoctrination by more powerful orators. So the sophists come in and they sway people because people aren't taught to think critically. And one of the best ways to learn to think critically is to actually learn the tools of thinking critically, which are not easy. It takes time and effort to learn them. All right? So ours is a demagogic rather than a democratic education. So he's saying we have more demagoguery going on in our schools than a democratic education. There's more indoctrination going on. The student who has not learned to think critically, who has not come to respect reason as the only arbiter of truth, right? We have reason and revelation, but our tradition has been committed to epistemological realism, to this belief that there are arguments, there's reality out there that can be discernible, that can be argued for. The Quran uses rational, there's a book Imam al-Ghazali wrote, which is called Qustas al-Mustaqim, which is showing that the Quran is using rational arguments. It's giving us arguments and saying, here, look, did you think of this? Did you think of this? And telling people to use their intellects, to reflect, to think. But don't fall back. Quran is constantly saying, don't fall back on tradition. Don't say, oh, well, this is what we found our fathers doing. No, what if your fathers were fools? Did you ever think of that? So the Quran is challenging people constantly to think critically. The student who has not learned to think critically, who has not come to respect reason as the only arbiter of truth in human generalizations, who has not been lifted out of the blind alleys of local jargons and shibboleths, will not be saved by the order of the classroom from later succumbing to the orator of the platform and the press. To be saved, we must follow the precept of the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican, High Anglican Church. Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Right? When you read your scripture, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. Understand what's on. So anyway, I want to look at, I wanted that as a preface. Now I want to look at the idea, going deeper into the idea of the first type of reading, which is a structural reading, understanding the skeleton of a book. Now, one of the things he says you have to do is the first rule, you have to determine what type of book you're reading. And you would be surprised at how few people can actually do this. Like people read books, but they actually don't know what type of book they're reading. Now, one of the helps in modern publishing is they usually classify the book on the back now. All right? So that's a help because it tells you what category. But he says the fundamental, you have to, he talks about different types of reading. One of them is reading for amusement. And most of the opiate literature out there, all these magazines and Time and Snoozweek and all these things that are out there, that's what people read them for. It's a kind of entertainment. Even the news generally is become entertainment, right? So that type of reading is a very superficial type of reading. And then you have also, you have a type of reading that is for enjoyment, which is related to the amusement, but less so. But you can read like literature. Now there's different types of literature. You have high literature and low literature. A lot of people don't like those distinctions anymore because we're in an age of leveling. But there actually is high literature and low literature. High literature was once open to anybody. It wasn't an aristocratic thing, like anybody who could read or write read good literature. And generally good literature, we forget that Charles Dickens was a popular writer. Most of the elite looked down on him, right? I mean, we forget that he was serialized in magazines. Whereas now he's considered high literature, but at the time he was not. A. Conan Doyle, he was a writer for magazines. And now it's considered kind of a high literature because the writing was so much better at that time. So if you look, you can read a book, like for instance, Moby Dick is, you're just not going to read that for, I mean, some people will enjoy it, but it's a hard read. So there are books, even when it came out, people had a hard time with it. But there are books that are narrative works of imagination, like for instance, Anthony Trollope. He's a famous British writer. He actually outsold Dickens, but he's less known than him today. But he wrote a book called As We Live Now, I think. Yeah, As We Live Now. And that book is about the modern age emerging and how it was affecting Britain. So it's kind of a sociological work. I mean, it's interesting that Steinbeck, who wrote The Grapes of Wrath, about when they had the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, and then the Dust Bowl Okies came out here. We still have remnants of that. If you go inland to Stockton in California, you will find people that trace their roots back to Oklahoma because they came here during the Dust Bowl to work in picking things. Steinbeck wrote a book called The Grapes of Wrath. That book is used in sociology classes. So even though it's a work of quote-unquote imaginative literature, it has a lot to do with sociological circumstances that he was living and watching and seeing because he was in California at that time, and other books of his also reflect that. So imaginative literature is often a literature that reflects a time and a place. And you can learn a lot about Victorian working conditions from the books of Charles Dickens. You can learn about child labor, and you can learn about child abuse. I mean, I would argue, who's read Catcher in the Rye? Put way up, I want to see. Okay, not everybody, but almost everybody. Did you read it? No, I can't believe that, really? You didn't have to read that? Wow. Okay, that was an assigned book for me. How many was it assigned for? Okay. How many read it a second time? Okay, 2 people. Why did you read it a second time?
I was much younger when I read it the first time.
Okay, good. That's a great reason to read it a second time. Yeah, so you wanted to read it again, okay? Because I did that. I read it a second time about 5 years ago. Yeah. So what did you think the second time? Was it the same book?
No.
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't the same book, was it? Now, how did it affect you?
On the second reading?
Yeah.
Well, I think when I read it the first time, I identified with the protagonist a lot more than I did.
Yeah, Holden Caulfield.
Right, Holden Caulfield. And so the second time I found myself almost more aligning myself with sort of more of the authoritarian figures.
Okay, great, interesting. Yeah, no, that's fantastic, yeah. Okay, so when I read that, I think I was 16, I totally related to it. Like everything was phony to me. I got Holden. Like I literally, I felt we could have been best friends. I went to prep school, so I know that world that he was in very well. Okay, now the second time I read it, which was about 5 years ago, okay, my brother reads it about every year. He loves that book. But the second time I read it, I actually thought it was about child abuse, like pedophilia. And I saw a whole subtext there that I hadn't seen before, because he talks about the perverts and the teacher that tries to seduce him or he thinks he is. Maybe not. It's kind of ambiguous. We don't know. But he's out there. He wants to protect children from the horrors of the world. Now that's kind of seen as this, he doesn't really want to grow up. But the subtext that I really saw in that book, and I would not be surprised if he was either a victim or somebody in his family or something, because I saw a subtext of pedophilia in that book, and that he was deeply troubled by the abuse of children and how adults really corrupt children. I didn't see that at all in the first reading because I couldn't have. I didn't have any frames of reference for that at that time. And one of the things that any parent is concerned about, and I've got 5 kids, is, the perverts. Anybody parents are very protective about this, especially in a culture. In any culture, but in our culture, it's more open, so we know a lot more about it. You can go online and Google the number of perverts in any neighborhood, and you kind of get shocked, to find out that, within, I think, 5 miles of our area, there were 7 registered sex offenders. I mean, it's deeply troubling, right? So anyway, that's an example of, reading a book of imaginative literature like Catcher in the Rye, and recognizing that it's not just for amusement or enjoyment. There's a lot going on in that story, and a lot can be gleaned from it. So, there's different reasons that we read, but you have to first categorize the book and then understand why you're reading it. Some people just want a good yarn. There's a whole slew books out there that are like romance novels, poorly written, and they're just the same plots over and over, like Indian films. Like I don't understand Indian films, because if you've seen one, you've seen every single one, right? But people like them. They watch them over and over and over again, right? It's always the same thing. Really, really rich girl, really poor guy, sees the rich girl, falls in love with the rich girl, but there's no way he can marry. But then in the end, it find out he's actually a prince that was, kidnapped when he was a little kid, and so he's actually can marry her, and something like that. I mean, they're all around those things. But there's a lot of books that follow those. In fact, every really romance is about that. Boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl. There's all these obstacles to getting to girl. In the end, boy gets girl. I mean, that's a common motif. And that's why there's writers that have written books about there's only 36 plots, narrative plots. Mm-hmm.
And are you sure you didn't watch the same movie again and again?
I'm just kidding. I've only seen 2 Indian films. See, that's called hasty generalization. That's actually a logical fallacy. Right? It's a material fallacy in logic. Yeah, I have no right to talk about Bollywood films because I've only seen 2, right? But they were exactly the same. So I assume they were all the same. So I admit, so you caught me out, right? See, critical thinker here. So now then, see, once he in this book, if we look at how he's set his book up, the structure of the book, the first is the activity. So you can learn a lot from the table of contents. A lot of people, oddly enough, don't read tables of contents. They don't even read the preface or an introduction. In an expository book, I mean, novels don't have preface or introduction unless it's a classic, and then later on some scholar writes some introductory article of why you should read that book. But when they're first published, they don't. But usually a good writer will tell you why he's writing the book in the preface, and usually in the introduction. Often in the first chapter, he's going to give you some kind of structure of what he's going about. Not always, but oftentimes. So, he's got, basically the book's divided into 3 parts. The first part is the activity of reading. So he talks about the reading of reading. Reading is learning, teachers dead or alive. And then he differentiates between what he calls original communications, which are books that are written with something that's really never been put into writing before. So Copernicus is an example of a totally original communication, even though some Aristarchus and others did hold a heliocentric view in ancient Greece, but Copernicus lays down a hypothetical foundation for a heliocentric universe. It was a revolutionary book. It's original communication. Don Quixote, even though it's an imaginative literature, it's really the first novel. I mean, we just don't have a novel like that. There's nothing like that before Don Quixote's book. And he somehow was aware, because it's very clear in the book, that he knows this book is going to be read till the end of time. That's one of the interesting things about some of these books. Like the Iliad's like that. There's an awareness of that. So if we look, and then he says the defeat of the schools. So what he shows here is that our schools aren't teaching people how to read. Basically, he says they do up to the 6th grade level and they do a good job. After the 6th grade, people don't learn how to read. Reading it takes a lot of work. And this is what he's arguing, is that they're poor readers. One of the things in grad school that they're really testing you for is your ability to read, to analyze. But that's just a small, they just give you like a few paragraphs, right? How do you analyze a whole book? It's a lot different from analyzing a paragraph or a sentence. And this is what he's saying, that our schools have failed us, because we can go through these schools, spend all this time, and yet we really don't know how to read at a deep level. And so what he says is he's going to give us some really useful tools. Now, there's what's really interesting, and I want to show you something that I thought was, to me, one of the most interesting. Well, there's a couple things here. One of the things that he says is that he talks about skills, that you have to, there's a certain set of skills that you have to acquire. And there's a difference between knowing rules and then knowing how those rules operate, like to be able to operate something. So the operation is very different from just knowledge of the rules. We can learn all the rules of driving, like you can memorize that book and know all the rules, but you don't know how to drive. You have to practice driving. That's how you learn how to drive. So he argues that, look, I'm going to give you some rules. You have to practice the rules. These rules are not going to make you a better reader just by knowing the rules. Until you actually practice the rules and become skilled at the rules, you're not going to be able to do that. And he's primarily writing for expository reading, knowledge-based reading. And this is what a lot of what you're going to be doing here and what you have been doing is expository reading. Reading where you're reading to learn something, grammar, fiqh, theology, history, whatever it is. That's what you're reading. And that's why this book is incredibly useful to get better at that, better at the retention, because when you do this work, people say, oh, I read, but I don't remember what I read, because they didn't read. If you actually read a book like he's suggesting, trust me, you will remember the structure of the book. You'll remember what the book was about, all right? So he says that any art or skill is possessed by those who have formed the habit of operating according to its rules. In fact, the artist or craftsman in any field differs thus from those who lack his skill. He has a habit they lack. You know what I mean by habit here. I do not mean drug addiction. Your skill in playing golf or tennis, your technique in driving a car or cooking soup is a habit, right? And habits, I mean, he's an Aristotelian at root, Adler. He loved Aristotle and he knew him very well. And Aristotle talks about the habits that are inculcated. Like virtue is a habit. You habituate yourself. And the Prophet ﷺ this is also our school, because the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. Knowledge comes through the hard work of acquiring knowledge. Ta'allum in Arabic is from the tafa'ul root, which is for difficulty. Yatakallaf. When you use that, I mean, it could be other things. It could be to avoid something, yatajannab. But tafa'ala in Arabic, that form is the form of doing something with difficulty. Tahammala. See, hamala means he carried, but tahammala, he bore something, like it was difficult. Tahammalahu. That's different from hamalahu. Hamalahu could be easy. He carried. But when you say tahammala, he carried with difficulty. So the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الْعِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ. Knowledge is acquired through difficulty. You have to learn, and learning is not easy. It's not an easy thing, but it's incredibly rewarding. I mean, this is the beauty of knowledge. It's a rewarding thing to learn. Abu Hanifa said, if the kings knew the pleasure we were in, they would come with their armies to steal it from us. Right? Really, the pleasure of discovery. Wajada, to find something in Arabic means to become ecstatic. And to discover something and to learn something is an incredibly enriching experience. And so he says there's no other way of forming a habit of operation than by operating. That is what it means to say one learns to do by doing. The difference between your activity before and after you formed a habit is a difference in facility and readiness. See, you can do something in the beginning with difficulty, and you're not really prepared to do it, but as you acquire the habit, it becomes easier and easier. Anything you learn, most of you probably learned some sport. In the beginning, it's very difficult. It's hard to throw a football. It's hard to learn to catch a baseball. But once you learn it, it just becomes second nature. Sports, intelligence, spirituality, they're all the same. The basic rules are the same. Practice. You have to practice. People say, oh, you know, I'm doing my wird, I'm reading my Qur'an. I don't experience anything. Because this is consistent practice over time, and then you have to learn to do it right, because practice makes permanent, not perfect. It only makes perfect when you're practicing it properly. Right? That's how practice makes perfect, when you actually learn to do it properly. So then he says, so that is what it means to say practice makes perfect. What you do imperfectly, at first you gradually come to do with a kind of almost automatic perfection that an instinctive performance has. So you see somebody, you see somebody who can play an instrument like a piano, and it's amazing what they can do, but you didn't see the twinkle, twinkle, little star, the chopsticks. You didn't see that whole process to where they got to that point. And the same with the salihun. You didn't see them struggling with their nafs when they were younger. You see somebody who's old and he's conquered himself, or somebody who's educated. You didn't see all the hard work they put in. You didn't see the nights that they stayed up. You didn't see all the work that they put in. So it looks easy. They make it look easy. The Arabs call it as-sahl al-mumtana', the easy impossible. Right? But that comes through hard work. So everything that I've said so far about the acquisition of skill applies to the art of reading. There's only one difference between reading and certain other skills. To acquire any art, you must know the rules in order to follow them, but need not in every case understand the rules. So for instance, if you drive a car, you don't have to understand how the car works to be able to drive it. You just know that you have to put a key in, you turn the key, or now they have different things, you just get in and push the button. But you have to know these things, but you don't have to know how that electricity goes and the computer inside, all those things. Whereas he's saying with reading, it's not true. To understand the rules is to know more than the rules. Right? You have to know the principles underlying those rules. All right? So, now, to understand the rules of reading perfectly, you would have to know the sciences of grammar, rhetoric, and logic with consummate adequacy. And this is where the biggest failure of our schools has come. They don't teach people grammar, rhetoric, or logic. This is the trivium. Because the art of reading can only really be mastered if you have some skill in these essential arts of learning how to read. Right? Power. Art comes from a root word. Army is from the same root word. Right? It's power. The liberal arts are the arts that free you up to use your mind without the obstacles that are naturally there. So grammar, we don't teach grammar. People don't know what conditional sentences are. They don't know what adverbs really do. Right? So people can speak and they can read, but because they don't know these in any deep way, they'll never be able to read difficult works with any seriousness. And that's why this is what they knew. All of this incredible legacy is based on mastery of these fundamental skills. These were called al-ulum al-ala in our tradition, the instrumental sciences. They were the sciences of instrument. They enabled you to do something. And the most important thing was understanding. So he says it would take a book 10 times long to expound the sciences which make the rules of reading and writing intelligible. Now most of you, I would say everybody in this room, has some level of grammar because you can read and you can write and do these things. And you also have some level of logic, because to be human is to be logical. I mean, that's humans do things based on reason. There's a reason why, I clip my nails because it's sunnah, but I would clip them anyway because, I don't want my nails to catch on things. So there's a reasoning behind most of what we do, right? We reason things through. So humans by nature reason. It's part of our nature. But learning the rules of reasoning is a whole other level. Because when you learn the rules of reasoning, and then also you learn how sloppy reasoning works, how fallacies work, right? How, if you learn like poisoning the well, that's a material fallacy. If you know how that works, when you see a politician throwing mud at another politician, you don't believe him just because he's saying that, because that's poisoning the well. It's a type of fallacy just to simply believe that so-and-so is wrong because Newt Gingrich said he's wrong. Because he has an agenda when he speaks ill of that other person. So a critical thinker is just not going to believe that. He's going to find out for himself whether this is true or not, right? So it helps, you can protect yourself from these things. And then he says, but what happens to many logicians and grammarians? They spent their life studying the sciences, but they can't read or write. So you can learn the sciences really well, but you still don't really know how to apply them. So it's like learning the rules, but not how to operate with those rules. All right? So now, he said, you can't learn to read by just reading this book any more than you can learn to drive a car by perusing the manual. So you have to really put into implement what he says. All right. So. And now one really nice thing that he says here, he says we should assume that the author is intelligible until he's shown otherwise. Not that he is guilty of nonsense and must prove his innocence. And the only way you can determine an author's guilt is to make the very best effort you can to understand him. So that's important charitable reading, that we should assume that a writer is telling the truth before we assume that it's just false. But we have to understand him to make that judgment. Now, he talks about the second part 2 is called the rules. And this is where he gets into the rules. And this is really important. He says, if something is worth reading at all, it is worth reading at least 3 times. All right? Now, for me personally, just to let you know, there's books that I've read just several times. There's books that I go back again and again. And a great book is a book that is inexhaustible. And the one, obviously, for us, the greatest book is the Quran. And that's why the best thing that you can do, khairul a'mal, right? The best of actions is beginning the Quran, ending it, and then beginning it again. It's continually reading the Quran because it's always going to open you up to new insights. The Quran, I've been reading Surah Al-Waqi'ah for just years. You read it every day. I still find stuff in there. And it's just like, whoa, I never thought of that. So you can read something that has a lot of meaning again and again. But he says, lest you become unduly alarmed at the demands that are going to be made on you, let me hasten to say that an expert reader can do these 3 readings at the same time. All right? Now, but they are, strictly speaking, 3 in manner. To be well read, each book should be read in these 3 ways each time it is read. All right? So now, then he talks, and this is really important for you as students, he talks about something that experimental psychologists know about learning a complex skill, because learning how to read is a complex skill. Learning how to play tennis is a complex skill. Learning how to play a musical instrument is a complex skill, right? If you learn piano, you have melody, right? You have melody, you have bass, right? And then you have chords, you have harmony, right? So and then you got rhythm. You have to learn all these things, and initially you can only learn one at a time. But once you master that skill, the skills become one. Now this is really important, so hear what he says. There's a beautiful book called Mastery, which I read years ago by George Leonard, and he talks about the same thing, and it really helped me. He talks about 3 types of people, of learners. They're what he calls the dabblers, the hackers, and the masters. And the dabblers, he says, are people that they find out about something and they get really excited about it. So like they just discovered tennis, and so they go and they buy, if they're wealthy, they buy the best tennis racket. They get or you see these kind of guys on the bikes with all this, they think they're like, who's the biker, famous guy? What's his name? Huh? Lance Armstrong. Yeah, you see them all over, these guys, Lance Armstrong wannabes. They've got the shirt, even with the corporate sponsors, and he's out there with his pot belly just on the weekend, but he's like, So you have dabblers that get into something, they get really excited. Oh, you can't believe what I discovered, and I'm taking lessons. And then couple weeks into it, maybe a couple months, it's not happening. So you say, hey, how's that tennis going? How are those lessons? They say, yeah, no, I gave it up. But I can't wait to tell you about the latest thing and then he's into another thing, right? So that's the kind of, the dabbler. And then there's the hackers. And these are people that learn to do something to a certain degree of skill, right? So they get reasonably good at something, different levels of it. Amateur people that just, they have the same game, they go out and they play, they enjoy it, and they've learned a certain level, like a golfer who golfs about 90 every time. It's just, they're hackers. Then he says there's the masters. And he said the master is not somebody who's mastered something. He's somebody that's committed to continual improvement. You see, now many of us are dabblers in spirituality. Many of us are hackers in our prayer. We're hackers. We've gotten to a certain level. We know how to pray. We Allahu Akbar. We go through. But the master is somebody who wants more presence every time they pray. They're committed to constant improvement in their practice. When they read, they want to become better readers. They want to have more understanding. And this is the path of mastery. So he talks about the learning plateau. So what happens when you first begin to do something that you haven't done before? Initially, you're going to see improvement. Like when I learned to type, you get to a certain level and you get really, you increase pretty quick. But then you hit what's called a learning plateau. And then things just stop. And it becomes, it's difficult because you're just not improving. And so you feel like a lot of people will give up. The dabbler will give up at that point. The hacker will wait it through and then they'll move to the next plateau. Now what they discovered about learning plateaus is these are actually the periods when you're learning. This is even though it's the most difficult time, you're learning during this time. And that's where the jump comes from. Do you see? So, and exercise is like that. You'll start exercising. Initially, you'll start seeing changes in your body, but then it stops. And then it's like a couple months and nothing, and then something changes, right? It's the same thing. Everything's like that. These are the sunan in creation. And so, the rule that every bit of practice makes a little more perfect appears to break down in these learning plateaus. The learner gets off the plateau and starts to climb again. The curve which records his achievements again shows steady progress from day to day. Plateaus are not found in all learning curves, but only in those which record progress in gaining a complex skill. All right? So now this is I just really think this is so amazing because there's so much in this statement. So I really want you to think deeply about this here. Knowing that the plateaus in learning are periods of hidden progress may prevent discouragement. So when you're feeling like, no, I'm not going anywhere, knowing this, that you're on a learning plateau, will keep you going. Persevere. Keep pressing on. Just keep going. Because you're going to have that jump again. Like in your Arabic, I'm just doing this thing and it's just not happening. And then one day, suddenly something clicks. And let me tell you something. This is the God's honest truth. I read certain books for years and it just suddenly something clicked with it. I would just read them and sometimes I actually thought I was understanding them. But certain books, they just clicked for me. Writers, they just, there's certain writers that are really difficult in the Arabic tradition that I just found easy to read, but it didn't come immediate. It was hard work. And that's what you have to remember, that this really is hard stuff. So now the beauty of the beginner's mind in Zen, the Zen have a tradition about the beginner's mind. The beauty of the beginner's mind is that the beginner is very conscious of everything when they're first learning something. And that's why a lot of people are self-conscious. And that's why you'll never learn to speak a language if you're self-conscious. I mean, when I first learned Arabic, I would talk to any Arab. And I didn't care how I sounded. I really wanted to learn the language. You have to be willing to make those mistakes. But if you've got that, I don't want to look silly or I don't want to make those mistakes, you just won't learn. So being willing to make mistakes When you read, you're going to make mistakes in reading Arabic. You can't care. You just read. It doesn't matter. That's how you're going to learn. So now listen to this. Higher units of activity are getting formed even if they do not increase one's efficiency all at once. The multiplicity of the rules indicates the complexity of the one habit to be formed, not the plurality of distinct habits. Did you get that? Okay. The multiplicity of the rules, right? The fact you've got a lot of rules, the multiplicity of rules indicates the complexity of the one habit to be formed, not the plurality of distinct habits. All right? So in other words, he uses the analogy of tennis. If you're learning tennis, you have to learn how to serve. So that's one thing you have to learn. And you have to do that separate from learning how to work a baseline or learning how to do a forehand or a backhand, right? So the backhand, there's a certain thing they'll teach you how to hold the racket properly. And then each one of those are separate things. But the act of playing tennis is one habit. A tennis player knows one thing, and that thing is tennis. Do you see? Even though it's made up of these different things, but those different things are not separate habits. They're all part of one habit, all right? So, now, this is really interesting to me. The parts acts coalesce and telescope as each reaches the stage of automatic execution. In other words, it all starts to come together and telescope when you begin to master this thing. It becomes one thing, right? When all the subordinate acts can be done more or less automatically, you have formed the habit of the whole performance. Then you can think about beating your opponent in tennis or driving your car to the country, because when you drive, you're doing all these separate things that when you first were learning to drive, they were all separate things that you had to think about. You know, the car behind or at the side, and the brake pedal and the clutch and it's all these. But once you learn how to drive, you don't think about these things. It's coalesced into one thing. This, to me, is the most significant thing in this whole book. This is an important point. At the beginning, the learner pays attention to himself and his skill in the separate acts. When the acts have lost their separateness in the skill of the whole performance, the learner can at last pay attention to the goal, which the technique he has acquired enables him to reach. It's Tawheed. You see, everything is indicating Tawheed. Allah has made a world where everything you do appears to be separate. But the reality of it is there's nothing separate. وَفِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ لَهُ آيَةٌ تَدُلُّ عَلَى أَنَّهُ وَاحِدٌ. Abu al-Atahiyya said, in everything is a sign indicating divine unity. You see, these are signs. It's all moving to unity. Everything we're doing is moving to unity. A unity of understanding, of perception, until you can see everything. This whole thing is being held together by one unified power. The whole thing. All at once. Allah has this whole thing being held together by one unified power. His qudra, His ilm, and His irada. That's the whole thing. And so everything that you're learning in life is all moving towards this understanding when things coalesce. When you enter in, you know, one of the things, I mean, sports is an interesting metaphor. I read a beautiful book called All Things Shining, where they really use sports as a metaphor for this, because one of the few things our culture really acknowledges is excellent in sports. But one of the things about a great moment in sports, you know, when a pitcher is having a perfect game in baseball, you know what happens to the team? You know? Nobody talks to him. They completely, everybody just stays away, because he's entered into a completely different zone. They call it the flow in sports psychology. They're in the flow, right? And great athletes know this, you see. And it's when everything becomes unified. They're not experiencing separateness. They're in a total state of everything's perfect. And that's when he pitches a perfect game, you know, shutout, no hitter. Just strikeout after strikeout. And nothing goes wrong. It's a perfect flow. This is the state of the saints all the time. Right? This is where they're at. This is where the awliya are at. It's perfect flow. And that's why they don't get disrupted. They don't get disturbed. because they're aware. Now reading at the highest level is that. You're in a state of flow. That's why he's saying if you learn these rules, the more you work at them, you will begin to read in a state of flow, where all of these things are making sense. They've coalesced and telescoped for you, but it's hard work.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose one have all these rules in mind and we say them critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and then start kind of arguing with the author who is not there.
Yeah. To defend himself?
Yeah, so it doesn't decrease the effectiveness or efficiency.
You know, look, the critical reading is a third level. It's a very high level of reading because, you know, and Mutanabi, one of my favorite quotes of Mutanabi is كم من عيب قولا صحيحا وآفاته من الفهم السقيم. How many people find fault in what they're reading, and the fault is in their own understanding. Right? So you can't read at a critical level until you really have a solid understanding of what the author is saying, and that takes a level of proficiency in these skills. Because people make grammatical mistakes. I mean, they literally read things wrong. In Arabic, it happens all the time. They think something is mansub and it's marfu'. Changes the meaning completely. Or they think the min is for tab'id and it's for ibtida. That happens all the time. That's why our scholars exhausted these possibilities. What time? How long have we been going?
7:15.
Okay, so let's do the poem because I really want you to get this stuff, so I don't mind taking time with it. I was going to show you a couple books, but let's do the poem. Okay, what I want you to do, this is a Robert Frost poem, and I want you to, again, just read the poem. Can we put it up on the... Okay, so Robert Frost is probably one of the most famous American poets of the 20th century. He wrote, he's unusual in that he wrote in traditional meter, right? He used a tetrameter and pentameter usually, and trimeter sometimes he did, but he does it in a very, it's very subtle, like you really don't feel the verse that you do in others, but if you actually do the work to scan the poem, you'll see by the rules of prosody that he's actually very strict. He said writing poetry without meter was like playing tennis with the net down, so he just didn't really like that kind of modern school. But this poem is one of his famous poems. It's called Acquainted with the Night. So are there any words that nobody understands in there? Everybody, it's a pretty simple, he liked to use the Anglo-Saxon words. He has one, well, he's got a couple, but the one word there that is clearly a, luminary, right? What's luminary mean? What's luminous? Yeah, shining, right? Luminous, bright, from lumina, right? Okay. So that's pretty much it. So let's look at this poem. First of all, what was your feeling when you read it? Right? Sha'ir in Arabic means the one who feels. Sha'ara. And sha'ara is hair, because it's that tactile. So the poet feels things. And feeling is very important with poetry, how it gets you. You know, Mauritanian, one thing I really liked when I lived with Mauritanians is that if you quote a line of poetry that they like, they go, you know, like they got hit in the gut, you know, because it's kind of a cultural thing, so it's a funny thing because they do it because they heard their teachers doing it and things, but it's very real, you know. They feel poetry. So what did you feel when you read it? Veronica? Yeah, there's definitely a melancholic feeling to this poem, isn't there? And he uses some words there that evoke a melancholy state, a sad state, right? Like walking out in rain. It doesn't sound like singing in the rain, because he walks out and he walks back in rain. I mean, there's kind of a, you know, it didn't get bright and the sun didn't come out. So there's definitely, yeah, and he's got sad in there, drop my eyes. That's what we do when we're sad or depressed. We kind of drop our eyes, and then he actually looks down the saddest city lane, right? So what else? Okay, there's a wandering going on. Yeah, he's walking out and we don't really know where he's going. He just tells us he kind of goes past the city lights. It's dark there, and he's not really telling us why. And he's walking around, and the watchman's kind of wondering, what are you doing out here? You know, it's kind of a meandering. Anything else?
There's a point to the wandering. There's a point to being in those sad moments.
Yeah,
Acquainted with
There's definitely a point to all this. Yeah, he's learning something, right? Now, what does that evoke? The word, like he doesn't know the night, huh? Do you think intimacy, acquainted? Familiar is closer. Like I'm acquainted with him. I mean, when we talk about an acquaintance, it's not really a friend. He's just somebody we're familiar with. He's not a stranger, but he's not a friend either. So there's a kind of ambiguity there, right? Anything else?
He's accepting what's like the sadness of it. He's just accepting it.
Let's look at it line by line. So we've kind of looked at the whole poem. Now let's look. I have been one acquainted with the night. So right out off the bat, I have been one. He doesn't say I am acquainted with the night. I have been one. One out of what? Many. Yeah. Okay, so I'm an individual. Like he's declaring his individuality here. I am one. I have been one. Like I'm an individual, and my experience of the night is my own experience, right? So he's right at the outset, he's letting us know, this is my experience. I, look at that, I, right? I mean, he's letting you know, this is my experience. I earned this knowledge that I have of the night, and how did I do it? I have walked out in rain and back in rain. Well, what does that mean? I mean, going out at night in rain, do people do that? Sometimes. But why would they do that? Seriously, why would they do that? Generally, you know, what would you think about going out at night in rain? Why would you do that? Well, no, I'm talking about just normal. Don't think of what he's saying. I'm just talking about when somebody goes out at night in rain, what do you usually think about going out at night in rain? You have to, right? There's some kind of emergency or something. But that's not why he's going out at night, right? He's going out for another reason. But normally when we think about, I had to go out last night and it was raining, right? So he's saying, look, I know the night, like I've gone out even when it's raining. I'm acquainted with different types of nights, even when it's raining, when other people wouldn't go out. Right? So I have walked out in rain and then back in rain. Right? I have outwalked the furthest city light. What does that mean?
You left the city? You left the city?
Yeah, but what's it? I have outwalked the furthest city light. He's gone into the darkness. I wasn't content to experience the night when there was still light. I've gone out into the dark. I've outwalked the furthest city light, right? Now, I have looked down the saddest city lane. I mean, what is that? First of all, what is that saddest city lane? Can city lanes be sad? Can they be sad?
At least the poet is.
For the poet, right? He's sad. Look, so lanes can evoke sadness, right? But he's personifying now. So he's giving the city lane the personification, right? He's anthropomorphizing a city lane by telling us it was a sad city lane. Not only sad, he's using the superlative. I have looked down the saddest city lane. Like a ghetto, right? What does that evoke? Some horrible, desolate place, derelict houses, right? And all of our cities have this, don't they? And you can go right down the road, right down here, and you can see the saddest city lane. And there's people living on that lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat. All right? Well, what does that mean? First of all, why do we have watchmen? I mean, watchman's a nighttime job, isn't it? Really, right? Why do we have watchmen? Yeah, security, but why? Yeah, why do you feel insecure in the night? Huh? It's dark, right? What do people do in the dark? Yeah, things they wouldn't do in the light, right? So I passed by the watchman on his beat. His beat. I mean, it's interesting, his beat, because he's on his beat, right? But he'll also beat you if you try to do something, in what he's watching. So, and drop my eyes unwilling to explain. What is that? Shame, exactly. Yeah, it's shame, isn't it? Like he dropped his eyes. Like the watchman shows up and he dropped his eyes. Why did he drop his eyes? Because he's unwilling to explain. Why is he unwilling to explain? Guilt would be one, but why is he unwilling to explain? He doesn't want to talk about why he's out there. Yeah, but what's he thinking about the watchman? Okay, yeah, the watchman's going to suspect him. Like, what are you doing out here at night? Because you should be at home in your bed, right? So the fact that there's a watchman is because people do nefarious things at night. And he drops his eyes, unwilling to explain, because what is that thing that happens when the policeman shows up and suddenly, like every time I come in through the border, they make me feel guilty. I don't know why. I'm just like, I haven't done anything, but that guy scares me because he makes me feel like I've done something wrong because where have you been? He starts questioning me. Like, where have you been? Who did you see? Was it business or like, why are you asking me all these questions? I feel like I'm being interrogated, and when somebody's interrogating you, you start getting self-conscious because he's suspecting me. He thinks, now why is he suspecting me? Because I'm Muslim, maybe. But I mean, why is he suspecting me? That's his job, right? That's the border patrol. But why does he suspect me? It's his job, but why? Why does he have that job? Because people do things, right? Humans do things. They smuggle, right? They do illegal things, right? So what he's saying there, right, is like, we're all condemned by the acts of some of us. We have some collective shame here, right? Because some people do these heinous things, and because some people do it, everybody becomes suspect. And so I'm dropping my eyes, like feeling this shame, and I'm unwilling to explain that it's this kind of collective guilt that we all have because some of us do these things. I might not be doing it, but I still feel that. I don't want him to suspect me. I drop my eyes. Right? I don't want him to suspect me. But because people do these things, I'm feeling that, right? And then I have stood still, right? So he's walking along, I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet, right? His own feet, right? Why? when far away an interrupted cry. Right? What does that mean, interrupted cry? What's an interrupted cry? I mean, a cries interrupt us, but what's an interrupted cry? How is a cry interrupted? It's stopped, isn't it? So like somebody's, ah, and then suddenly it stops. That's a little spooky, isn't it? Have you heard somebody screaming and suddenly the screaming just stopped? You know, you stop and you're like, what just happened? And he's going to tell us, but not to call me back or say goodbye. It wasn't that kind of cry. Goodbye, Robert, or Robert, come home. It was a blood-curdling cry, because dark things happen at night. People are killed at night, right? Murders happen, robberies, all these things happen at night. Okay, now he's on the terrestrial plane. Now what's he do? And further still, at an unearthly height. Something now is changing, right? What's he doing now? He's looking up, right? So he looks up, and what does he see? Right? What does he see? Yeah, he doesn't really tell us. He gives us some hints. It's a luminary. It's one, but so it could be the moon, but it's one what? A clock. It's one clock, and a clock has many parts, right? It's got hands, it's got the numbers, it's got, so, you know, and this is the thing about poetry. This is my interpretation. You're free to have your own, right? Because that's the beauty of poetry. For me, because I know his poetry reasonably well, and I know for a fact that he was very familiar with the stars, and he writes, stars come into his poems a lot. Like he's got poems about Orion kind of going over the fence, out watching Orion leap over his fence. So he knew that time, and he spent a lot of time at night walking those lanes. He knew that the night sky is a clock. Like I learned this when I went to the Sahara. So he looks up, and what does he see? One luminary clock against the sky, right? So suddenly that darkness is penetrated by what? By light, okay? So he sees the light at night. And what does that light proclaim? Because it's a clock. And what is a clock? It tells time. Night time, we call it nighttime and daytime. So there's two experiences of life on earth, right? The Quran talks about Allah made the night and the day khilfatan, like they alternate. لِمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يَتَذَكَّرَ أَوْ أَرَادَ شُكُورًا. The one who wants to become aware, to be reminded, and show gratitude, right? So what does he say? And further still, at an unearthly height. So we're in the celestial realm. He's left the earth now of sad city lanes and interrupted cries and watchmen looking for criminals. All that dark stuff that happens in the dark, he's left that. And now he's looking at a luminary light in the sky. And what's the light proclaiming? Proclaimed. That luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time is neither wrong nor right. What does he mean? Musab, what's he mean? What does he mean neither wrong nor right? What's wrong and right? First of all, what is that? What's that demarcation? It's a moral demarcation, right? Wrong and right is about morality. Now, who are the moral beings on this planet? Humans, right? Animals, if the lion eats you, you don't say it's an immoral lion. It's a hungry lion, and you just happen to be there. You can't impose. The lion has no moral agency because it doesn't have free will. It's an instinctual animal. It's acting on instinct. But humans act, right? They act based on moral agency. And so what's he telling us about what the heavens are proclaiming? What's he telling us? What's the heaven proclaiming? What's he realizing looking up in the heavens? the nighttime, the darkness and evil that men do at night is not about the time. It's not because it's nighttime. That's not what's wrong with the night. What's wrong with the night is us. We're what's wrong. The night's just neutral. It's what you do in the night that's going to determine whether the night is a good night or a bad night, right? Those are what humans do in the night. But he's saying, I've seen something else about the night. The night's much deeper than all this darkness. There's stillness at night. There's tranquility at night. There's peace at night. There's clarity at night. There's unity at night. There's all these other things. Time is neither wrong nor right. Right? It's what we do in time that makes it wrong or right. Right? I have been one acquainted with the night. Right? Anyway, that's one way to look at it. There's other ways, you know.
That means that the observer is responsible to decide that what is right and what is
I don't think it's because that would be like relativism. I don't think he's talking about relativism. I think to me, what he's saying is by looking up at the heavens, what the heavens are declaring, those lights in the night, what they're declaring is it's not the time. It's, you know, the sadness of that city lane at night, the trouble that the rain causes at night, the watchman looking for criminals at night, that blood-curdling cry that's interrupted that we hear at night, that's not, you know, that's not what makes the night. The night isn't wrong or right. It's what humans do that makes it wrong or right. The night is something stunning. It's something beautiful. We shouldn't be afraid of the darkness of the night. It's something to be acquainted with. There's power in the night because in the night the stars come out. In the night we can look up and see, you know, Plato said that God put stars in the sky so that people could look up and observe the order of the heavens. And in seeing celestial order, desire to bring that order back down to the earth. Right? As above, so below. He's watching the perfection of the night in the skies, and it obliterates those imperfections that we see here. You know, there's something much higher that when we elevate, when we look up, that's what will elevate us from all this horrible stuff that's going on down here. Because this isn't, don't let this determine your experience of the world. Right? Don't let what's happening down here. I mean, I was on the way today, you know, and I was late for something, and I saw this peregrine perched up on and he was just so noble, you know, and he was just perched up on the lantern, you know, on the street light. He was just perched there, and he was just like, and I was just like, what does he know? You know, what does the falcon know? Right? What does he know? He knows he's amazing. I'm not a sparrow. I'm not a blue jay. He knows. And you can see it in him, like just the way he looks around. He has, all the other birds, they're scared. They're all running around, little thing, they fly off. He doesn't. He's just like, I'm at the top here. I know I am. That, you know, humans are something amazing. Right? Humans are amazing. And you can look at all that darkness out there and you can decide that, oh, the world's wrong. But look a little higher. Elevate your head. You'll hear something proclaimed from the heavens. Time is neither wrong nor right. It's what you do with your time that makes it wrong or right. Yeah. Anyway, great. And
Going back to your phone, because when he uses the word acquainted, I mean, it seems like he's more than acquainted.
He's got intimate knowledge.
You know,
Yeah.
It seems like the night that he's talking about is not like that night with the moon and the sky. He's talking about this kind of.
He has intimate knowledge with the darkness, that human side of the night, but he's acquainted with that celestial. He sees another side. That's excellent. Great. Great insight, Rashida. Because that I totally agree with you on that. That the acquaintance is not with the saddest city lanes. He knows those intimately. It's not with the watchman. He knows that intimately. It's not with the interrupted cry. He knows those things intimately. What he's acquainted with is something much deeper. He knows it's deep, but he's only acquainted with it. Yeah. Good. Excellent. Mm-hmm.
There's a question online about the trivia.
Uh-huh.
If you can provide some advice on how someone can be more pleased with
Okay, I would say, first of all, to learn, grammar in the scholastic tradition did not just mean rules of grammar, it also meant literature. One of the things that all of our ulama had to learn was Jahili poetry, because poetry teaches you the nuances of language. Poetry is very ambiguous, and there's reasons for that. And if you want to read Revelation, the best way to learn how to read Revelation is to learn the poets, because they're really going to help you understand that Revelation, and this is why we didn't teach him poetry, and it wouldn't be appropriate because they're too close. They're too close. Revelation and poetry are too close. Because real poets are inspired, and we all know that. That's why we honor them, right? I mean, a real poet is there. Where did it come from? Like, where did they get those ideas? Where did that come from? Because we can't do that. Most people cannot do that. So the poet's somebody that, if you really understand language, you're in awe of great poets. And Revelation is not poetry by any means, and they can't be compared in that way. But what Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi says in Tanbih al-Ghafil, he says the reason they accuse the Prophet of being a poet is because of the similarity that Revelation has with poetry. It's language that, I know this means something. What does it mean? There's so much in it. It's pregnant with meaning. And you can exhaust yourself trying to understand the meanings, right? Mm-hmm. Just to finish, so, I would say that grammar, you really need to study. I mean, Arabic is a great language for grammar because you really have to know grammar to be able to read Arabic. That's not the case with English. It's a much easier language to read without knowledge of the rules of grammar, but you will lose a lot by not knowing what prepositions really mean. You'll know, if you don't know that adverbs, that they modify. He runs swiftly. You have to know what that's telling you about how he runs. And a lot of it we just know intuitively, but to understand the mechanics of it will really help you have a deeper level. So, I think grammar is really important. Rhetoric, in Arabic tradition, you have three stages of learning rhetoric, learning, tropes and figures, learning what they call muhassanat al-kalam, the ma'ani, like alliteration and antithesis and all these techniques that are used, internal rhymes and things like that, jinas, what's called jinas. Learning these things helps you understand the power of language. It also enables you to write better and to speak more effectively. But logic is to me, logic is foundational because logic gives you such a precision. And the only people in our culture that still study traditional logic to a certain degree are lawyers. And unfortunately, a lot of them learn, not all of them, there are a lot of good lawyers. So my brother's a lawyer, he's very honest. And so I'm not going to rag on, it's only about 99.9% of them. But there is that, lawyers do learn logical fallacies, they learn, but mastering, logic is basically three things. It's understanding, right? It's judgment and it's reasoning. These are the three acts of the mind. Understanding, which is called tasawwur in Arabic, is to be able to conceptualize something and really understand what it is. And that has to do with definitions and terms, like a term, understand. And he'll talk about that, coming to terms with the author to know what they mean. In classical adab al-bahth wal-munadara, and in classical scholastic tradition, anybody while you were talking could demand that you define the term. They used to say, distinguo, what do you mean by that? Like, see, we have people now talking about democracy. What do you mean by democracy? What do you mean? What does that mean? A democratic government. There's people who don't realize that democracies can be tyrannies, because a democracy and a tyranny they're two separate descriptions about government. Democracy tells you who rules, and tyranny tells you how much power they have in their rule, right? So you can have a democratic tyranny, right? You can elect tyrants. So knowing how to distinguish between terms is really important. And then judgment is about propositions, making declarative statements. All men are created equal. That's a proposition. The terms in there are men and equal, right? Propositions have two terms. All men are created equal, right? So the terms there, men created and equal. Created there already assumes a creator. Equal is a mathematical metaphor being used in a sociological sense, right? Because equal is about math. Things are equal to other things. 2 is equal, to 2, right? So, but 2 is not equal to 3. Anyway, so logic takes a while, but you can learn it. You can learn it in a year, and it's worth it. And I hope all of you will get out of here having a good sense of mantiq, because it's really important. They asked the Dalai Lama recently, what did he feel the most important thing here in America for people to study? He said, logic, right? Because Buddhists study logic. And Americans, we don't reason anymore, so we get into a lot of trouble. You have to be able to think clearly. Anyway, so inshallah, we'll continue on. But BarakAllahu feekum. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Alhamdulillah, just want to say Zaytuna College's mission is only a few sentences long. If anyone asked me to expound on that mission, I would say watch this talk that Shaykh Hamza just gave. And so we hope that everyone can benefit from this talk and ultimately apply many of the things that were mentioned in this talk. And then we hope that you can join us at Zaytuna College in building a great institution that has conversations like this, excites discussion like this, and then also join us for the next faculty lecture series, the faculty lecture. The details of the series will be available online on the Facebook page or on the website. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Zaytuna College is investing in a new home in Berkeley, California. Join us on February 25th for a benefit dinner featuring Sheikh and Hamza Yusuf, and find out how you can dedicate a brick to be permanently displayed at the new campus. Register today.